Welcome, settle in now, and let yourself grow still. Imagine, for a moment, that you're standing in a narrow corridor. The walls on either side of you are close enough to feel their chill if you reached out your hands, and the light here is dim. A single candle burns somewhere behind you, its flame barely troubling the darkness ahead. The floor beneath your feet is stone, cold and smooth, from generations of footsteps that came before yours, and the smell in the air is one of beeswax and coal smoke and something faintly floral, like dried lavender tucked between linens in a distant room. It is early morning. The great house above you is not yet awake, or rather, the family is not yet awake. But you have been awake for some time already. You have been awake since before the stars faded, since the darkness outside was still absolute and unbroken, since the only sounds were the distant creak of the house settling into itself and the soft rustling of other figures rising in other small rooms nearby. This is the world of the Victorian servant, not the grand world of drawing rooms and dinner parties and silk dresses catching candlelight. That world belongs to others. This is a quieter world, a world of back staircases and blackened hands and cold water in basins, of fires lit before the household stirs, of meals prepared and never tasted, of lives lived in the margins of other people's stories. And yet this world was rich. It was full of routine and ritual, of small kindnesses and private friendships, of pride taken in work well done, of a vast and intricate social order all its own. The servants who populated the great Victorian houses were not shadows or footnotes. They were people, fully alive, fully present, moving through their days with purpose and care in a world that was in its own quiet way, deeply ordered and deeply human. Tonight we're going to step into that world together. We're going to follow the hours of a Victorian household from before dawn until the last candle is snuffed out. We're going to move through the kitchens and the sculleries, up the back stairs and into the attic rooms. Across the vast expanse of the servants' hall and through the green baize door that separated two entirely different worlds existing under the same roof. There is no need to rush. The house is quiet. The fire is laid. Let us begin. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. Before the family stirred, before the first pale light crept across the bedroom curtains of those who slept in the rooms upstairs, the house was already alive. The housemaid was usually the first to rise. In large houses, this task often fell to the most junior of the housemaids, the between-maid or the tweenie, a young woman who occupied that uncertain middle ground between the kitchen and the upper floors, belonging fully to neither world and serving both. She would wake in the cold dark of her attic room, sometimes sharing a narrow bed or a thin-walled space with another girl, and she would dress quickly and quietly, her breath visible in the unheated air, her fingers fumbling with buttons in the dark. The attic rooms where servants slept were among the simplest spaces in the house. A small iron bedstead, a washstand with a basin and a jug of water that had often grown cold overnight, a chest of drawers, a small mirror. Perhaps, if the servant was fortunate or had been in a position long enough to accumulate small comforts, a framed photograph on the mantel, or a worn Bible on the bedside table, or a few dried flowers pressed between the pages of a letter from home. These rooms were not luxurious. They were not meant to be. But they were private, or nearly so, and in a life defined by public service and the constant presence of others, that small privacy was not nothing. The first task of the morning was fire, always fire. In a Victorian household, warmth was not automatic. It did not appear at the turn of a dial or the press of a switch. It had to be coaxed into existence from scratch each morning, and it had to be done quietly, with a kind of reverent skill that took years to master. The housemaid would carry her supplies with her, a brush, a dustpan, paper and kindling, coals brought up from the coal cellar, and she would move through the downstairs rooms in the dim pre-dawn, kneeling before each fireplace in turn. First she would rake out the cold ashes from the night before, working carefully to avoid sending up great choking clouds of grey dust. Then she would lay the paper, twist it into coils at the back of the grate. Then the kindling, arranged with an almost architectural care, each piece placed just so to allow air to move freely between them. Then the coals, small ones first, larger ones balanced above, and then the match. The moment when a fire caught, When the paper took and the kindling began to crackle and the first tongues of yellow flame licked upward through the carefully arranged structure, was a small private triumph, repeated every morning, quiet and unwitnessed and real. A good housemaid could lay a fire that would burn cleanly and steadily for hours. It was a skill, and it was taken seriously. While the fires were being laid in the reception rooms, other servants were beginning their own morning rituals in the kitchen. The cook, often one of the highest-ranking members of the servant hierarchy, a figure of considerable authority and sometimes considerable temperament, would already be in her domain, or would arrive shortly after the fires were lit, her first task being to bring the great kitchen range back to full heat after its overnight banking. The kitchen range was the heart of the Victorian servants' world. It was enormous, a vast iron construction that filled one entire wall of most large kitchens, its multiple ovens and hot plates and warming chambers, capable of producing everything from a delicate soufflé to a roasting joint to a pot of nursery porridge simultaneously. It required constant attention and constant maintenance. The range had to be cleaned and blacked each morning, its surface polished to a deep shine with a mixture of blacklead and elbow grease. The flues had to be opened, the dampers adjusted, the fire at its heart coaxed from ember to full burning life, with a skill that was as much instinct as knowledge. While the range was coming to temperature, the scullery maid, the lowest-ranking member of the kitchen staff, often very young, sometimes barely out of childhood, would be at the scullery sink, filling pots and kettles with cold water from the tap. The scullery was a small, damp, perpetually wet space adjoining the kitchen, its stone floor slick, its single window looking out onto a basement area below street level, where the light was grey and thin even in high summer. The scullery maid washed everything, every pot, every pan, every bowl and dish and glass that passed through the kitchen. She washed in cold water until the range had heated enough to provide hot. She washed with her hands reddened from the cold and the soda crystals used to cut through grease. She washed and washed and washed, and when she was not washing, she was peeling. Potatoes, turnips, carrots, onions. Her knife moving in quick practice strokes, the peelings curling into a basin at her feet. The kitchen maid assisted the cook, following her instructions with a concentration that was partly attention to detail and partly simple self-preservation. A cook in a bad mood was a formidable thing. The Victorian kitchen was a place of hierarchy as absolute as any military structure, and the cook's authority within it was nearly absolute. She planned the menus, ordered the supplies, directed the preparation of every dish, and was held personally responsible for the success or failure of everything that emerged from her domain. Up above, in the quiet of the house's upper floors, the ladies' maids and valets were at their own morning preparations. A lady's maid's first duty was to prepare her mistress's clothing for the day, to lay out the appropriate undergarments and outer garments, to ensure that everything was pressed and clean and in good repair, to have the dressing room warm and ready by the time her mistress rang for her. A valet performed the same service for the master of the house, brushing coats, polishing boots to a mirror finish, laying out the correct dress for whatever engagements the day held. These upper servants, the lady's maid, the valet, the housekeeper, the butler, occupied a curious social position. They were servants, unambiguously, in service to the family who employed them, but they were also the elite of the servant world, accorded certain privileges and distinctions that marked them apart from the kitchen and housemaids below. They dined separately from the lower servants, at a table in the housekeeper's room or the butler's pantry, and they were addressed by the lower staff with a deference that mirrored the family's own hierarchy above stairs. All of this was in motion before the first bell rang, before the family emerged from their rooms, before the morning ritual of breakfast and newspapers and letters began in the dining room above. The house had been cleaned and warmed and ordered. Fires burned, kettles steamed. The silver on the dining table had been polished to brilliance. The morning papers had been ironed. Yes, ironed to prevent the ink from transferring to the master's hands, and laid at his place. The toast was in its rack, the marmalade was in its pot. The whole elaborate performance of upper-class morning life had been silently prepared, and made ready by hands that would never be seen and never be thanked. The house was ready. It was waiting. And now, at last, from somewhere above, a bell began to ring. The coal cellar was one of the least visited and least considered spaces in a great Victorian house, but it was also one of the most essential. Situated in the furthest, lowest part of the basement, beneath even the kitchen sometimes, it was reached by a narrow, steep flight of steps, its walls perpetually blackened, the smell of coal dust thick and mineral and pervasive. The coal was delivered from outside, shoveled through an iron chute set into the pavement above, and it accumulated in rough, jagged heaps that had to be managed and redistributed, and eventually carried upward, bucket by heavy bucket, to feed the fires that kept the house alive. The hall boy carried coal. This was one of his defining duties, and it was dirty and heavy and entirely without glamour. He filled the coal scuttles, heavy iron vessels designed with a curved back to allow them to rest stably against the wall, and a long, narrow pour at the front, from the cellar supply, and carried them up to each room that required replenishment. In a house with 10 or 12 fireplaces in regular use, this could mean 8 or 10 trips through the day, each one involving the descent to the coal cellar, the filling of the scuttle, the careful ascent with a heavy and awkward load, the deposit of the scuttle in its corner beside the fireplace, and the return for the next one. The weight of coal that was consumed by a single Victorian house in a single winter week would be remarkable to us. Every fire burning all day, every range running continuously, the household's appetite for fuel was substantial, and the bill for coal was one of the larger regular items in the household accounts. The housekeeper noted it, the master paid it, and the hall boy carried it. And in the small repetitive labour of that carrying there was a kind of invisible importance, the invisible work that kept the visible world warm. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, the morning's tempo was quickening. The cook had been joined by the kitchen maid and the scullery maid, and the three women moved through the kitchen spaces with the coordinated efficiency of long familiarity. They did not need to announce their movements or negotiate who was where. Each had her territory, her task, her piece of the morning's work, and the choreography was enacted without direction or comment, as natural as breathing. The smell of the morning kitchen was one of the great sensory experiences of Victorian domestic life, not the polished, ordered scent of the public rooms, but something richer and more complex. The deep, slightly sweet smell of the range itself, the sharp fragrance of coffee being ground for the family's breakfast, the warm yeasty smell of bread in the oven, or of toast browning on a rack before the bars of the range grill, bacon or kidneys or kedgeree, the smells of the English breakfast in their full morning urgency, and beneath all of it, the permanent foundational smell of the kitchen itself, old fat, old wood, old stone, old fire. The kitchen garden was sending its first contributions of the day through the back door. The gardener or one of his boys brought a basket of vegetables each morning. What was ready, what was needed, what the cook had ordered through the housekeeper's note the day before. In autumn, this might mean leeks and cabbages and root vegetables, the last of the runner beans, perhaps some late apples from the orchard for a kitchen pudding. In summer, the basket would be piled with soft abundance. Tomatoes and beans and peas and lettuces. Whatever came in was examined by the cook with the critical eye of a professional receiving raw materials, any substandard item noted for feedback to the gardener, the good produce set aside for the appropriate use. The cook's relationship with the gardener was one of the more interesting professional dynamics in the below-stairs world. They were technically equals in the servant hierarchy, both heads of their respective domains, both reporting ultimately to the master or mistress, but they were also in a relationship of functional dependency. She needed what he grew what she needed. The negotiation of that need, what to plant, how much, when, was conducted through the intermediary of the housekeeper's orders, but in practice it was often a more direct conversation, a note sent out or a brief exchange at the kitchen door, the cook specifying more precisely what tomorrow's dinner required, the gardener assessing whether the kitchen garden could supply it. Outside the back door, beyond the kitchen yard, the stable was already active. The horses had been fed before the household woke, the coachman's first duty being the welfare of his animals, whose care preceded everything else in his morning schedule. Now the stalls were being mucked out, the fresh bedding laid, the horses groomed with brush and curry comb in the quick, practised way of people who perform the same physical task every day and have found their own most efficient rhythm for it. The smell of the stable was completely its own, warm and animal, layered with hay and leather, and the particular clean smell of well-groomed horse. The carriage standing in the coach house had been cleaned yesterday afternoon and would need only a light wipe over this morning to remove any overnight moisture. The harness hanging on its brackets in the harness room would need inspection, a regular checking of the leather for cracks or wear, the metal fittings for any sign of oxidation, the stitching for any signs of stress. The coachman who allowed harness to deteriorate was a coachman whose professional reputation was being eroded, and the Victorian coachman took his professional reputation seriously. All of this was happening simultaneously, in the various quarters and corners of the house and its grounds, each worker in their own space performing their own morning's work, all of it converging on the single moment when the house would be declared ready for the day, when the fires were going, the breakfast was prepared, the boots were cleaned, the beds were made, the hall was swept, and the household could be said to be, in that essential Victorian phrase, in order. The standards of that order were not arbitrary. They had been developed over generations, the accumulated wisdom of housekeepers and butlers and cooks who had found, through long experience, that certain things done in certain ways at certain times produced the results that a household's functioning required. The morning sequence had been refined until it worked, and once it worked you did not deviate from it without good reason. Variation was the enemy of reliability, and reliability was what the household depended on. This conservatism, the deep conservatism of the below-stairs world, is sometimes misunderstood as mere conformism or lack of imagination. But it was also a form of professional wisdom. A housemaid who had learned the correct sequence for cleaning a bedroom and followed it faithfully was not less intelligent than one who improvised. She was, in most cases, more efficient and more consistently effective. The routines that governed Victorian domestic service were routines that had been tested by thousands of repetitions in hundreds of households, and they worked. Which is not to say that there was no room for the individual within the system. The cook who had her own particular touch with a sauce, her own preferred way of bringing a pastry to its perfect short crumbling texture, her own sequence of seasoning adjustments that produced a result indistinguishable from the standard by those who ate it, but that she herself knew was quite different in method. She was exercising a genuine artistry within a framework of general practice. The butler who had developed his own slightly more efficient method of polishing glass, or the housemaid who had learned to make a bed that was slightly more tightly and perfectly smooth than the textbook method produced. These individual refinements were the craft dimension of work that was, on its surface, entirely routine. The bellboard was the nervous system of the Victorian house. It hung in the servants' hall or in a corridor off the kitchen, a wooden panel fitted with a row of small bells, each one mounted on a coiled spring, each one connected by a wire that ran through the walls of the house to a pull in some distant room. When a member of the family wished to summon a servant, they pulled the bell pull beside the fireplace or near the door, and down in the kitchen corridor, one of those small bells would jangle on its spring, swinging and trembling until its energy was spent. Each bell was labelled drawing room, library, morning room, master bedroom, dressing room, nursery. And a skilled servant could read that board the way a sailor reads the sky, not just identifying which bell had rung, but interpreting the pattern and timing of rings, understanding from context and habit who was likely to be ringing and what they probably wanted. The housekeeper managed the bellboard with the quiet authority she brought to everything. She knew the rhythms of the household, knew that the mistress rang twice in quick succession when she wanted tea, once slowly when she wanted her maid, knew that the nursery bell ringing before 7 meant the children were awake early, and the nursemaid needed assistance, knew that the library bell on a Tuesday afternoon usually meant the master required fresh notepaper and ink. This was a language without words, and it was the vocabulary of service. To the family upstairs, the bells were simply a convenience, a way of making their needs known without having to leave their rooms or raise their voices. But to the servants who answered them, each bell represented a specific task, a specific person, a specific set of expectations that had to be met exactly and without delay. There was no excuse for a slow response to a bell. There was no excuse for arriving at the wrong room or bringing the wrong thing. The entire system depended on a kind of attentiveness that bordered on telepathy, an ability to anticipate needs before they were expressed, to provide without being asked, to make the whole complicated business of daily life appear effortless from above stairs. The butler was responsible for the smooth functioning of the bells, as he was responsible for the smooth functioning of nearly everything in the house's public life. He was the senior male servant, the commander of the footmen, the keeper of the wine cellar, the superintendent of the dining room. In large establishments, the butler's position was one of considerable consequence. He might manage a staff of 10 or 15, oversee the household accounts in consultation with the housekeeper, and exercise a daily authority that was, within the servant world, nearly absolute. The butler's pantry was his domain, a small room fitted with shelves for the plate and glass, a lockable safe for the silver, a cleaning bench where the silver was polished each week to its requisite brilliance. It smelled of silver polish and old port and the particular clean mineral smell of well-maintained metal. The butler spent hours here, sometimes alone, sometimes with a footman assisting him, working through the silver with careful, methodical attention. Silver cleaning was not a pleasant task. The polish, a preparation containing fine abrasive particles, had to be worked into every surface, every engraved crevice, every scrollwork detail on a serving dish or candelabra, then buffed away with soft leather cloths until the metal returned its own reflection back at you with perfect clarity. A piece of silver that had been improperly cleaned, that showed smears or fingerprints or dull patches, was a failure visible to everyone at dinner, and the butler was responsible for ensuring that no such failure occurred. The footman worked under the butler's direction. In a well-staffed Victorian household, there might be 2 or 3 footmen, and their duties were as much about appearance as about service. Height was a consideration. Taller footmen were preferred, their imposing presence adding to the visual grandeur of the household. They wore livery when on duty in the family's presence, a formal uniform in the household's colours, with powdered hair in the most traditional establishments, or at least neat and carefully arranged in others. Their duties included answering the front door, carrying coal scuttles to the upstairs rooms, waiting at table during meals, accompanying the family on carriage outings, carrying messages and parcels, and performing whatever additional tasks the butler directed. It was work that required physical strength. The coal scuttles were heavy, the trays laden with silver were heavy. The constant movement up and down stairs over the course of a day was exhausting, but it also required a particular kind of stillness. When standing in attendance during a meal, a footman was not expected to listen to the conversation around him. He was expected, in a sense, to cease to exist, to be present without being present, visible without being seen. This trained invisibility was one of the strangest and most demanding aspects of Victorian service. The ideal servant was one who could move through the family's spaces without disturbing their consciousness of those spaces, who could appear at precisely the right moment with precisely the right thing, and then withdraw again without creating a ripple, who could anticipate a need so thoroughly that the need was met before it was felt. This required a sustained and extraordinary kind of attention, a constant, quiet, self-erasing watchfulness that had to be maintained through an entire long day. And yet within the servant world itself, there was nothing invisible or self-erasing about these same individuals. Below stairs, the footman who stood like a statue during dinner was free to be funny, opinionated, loud. The housemaid who moved like a ghost through the family's rooms was among friends a lively talker, a person with stories and preferences and a whole interior life that never crossed the threshold of the green baize door. The green baize door, covered in that dense, slightly rough fabric in a dark bottle green, was both literal and symbolic. Every house had one. It was the boundary between the world of the family and the world of those who served them, and it swung in both directions, but it was understood by everyone on both sides that it represented something more than just a door. Beyond it, the carpets gave way to stone or bare wood. The wallpapers gave way to plain whitewash. The ornamented ceilings gave way to low, serviceable plaster. The worlds were adjacent, intimate, intertwined at every hour of the day, and utterly, rigorously separate. The bells rang on, another pull, another jangle, another servant turning from whatever they were doing and moving toward the sound. The bellboard's history in the Victorian household extended back several decades before the period we are considering, and its technology, by the 1880s, had reached a kind of perfection in its own terms. The springs were calibrated to produce a sound distinct enough to be heard from the servants' hall, but not so loud as to disturb the family above. The wires were routed through carefully bored channels in the walls, maintained by the estate carpenter when they stretched or frayed, replaced on a schedule that the housekeeper tracked in her maintenance book. A broken wire was a domestic emergency of sorts. A room cut off from the communication system, its occupants unable to summon assistance without resorting to the indignity of shouting or going to find a servant in person. In some of the most modern houses of the period, the bells were already being supplemented by speaking tubes, copper pipes that ran between rooms fitted with mouthpieces and earpieces, allowing a kind of vocal communication between floors. You could call down a speaking tube to the kitchen and receive an answer in seconds. You could report a room's needs without a footman making the journey upstairs. This technology felt, to those who first encountered it, almost magical. Your voice travelling through walls, emerging from a small circular fitting on a distant wall, as clear as though you were standing in the same room. But the speaking tube had its limitations. It required both parties to be at their respective ends simultaneously. It could not easily reach multiple destinations, and it lacked the graceful simplicity of the bell, which asked only for a pull and produced its ring and set the system in motion without any further human intervention. The telephone was beginning to make its appearance in the most forward-looking households of the 1880s and 1890s, a technology so new and strange that many domestic manuals of the period dealt with it only tentatively, offering guidance on the correct forms of address and the proper management of what was still, for most people, an almost incomprehensible novelty. For servants, the telephone created a new set of requirements and uncertainties. Who should answer it? The butler, as the senior male servant responsible for the household's communication with the outside world. The footman, as the person most immediately available in the hall. The question of telephone etiquette in the Victorian household was genuinely unresolved, and different establishments handled it differently. But these were the edges of change. At the centre of the daily work, the bells still rang, the servant still answered, and the system functioned as it had always functioned. Through the quiet, constant attentiveness of people trained from early in their careers to respond to the sound of a spring-loaded bell with immediate and purposeful movement. The footman who stood in attendance during dinner occupied a strange and specific kind of consciousness during those long evening hours. He was not idle. He was watching, always watching, for the moment when a glass needed refilling, when a dish needed removing, when the signal came from the butler that the next course was ready. But he was watching in the particular way of someone who has learned to attend without thinking, a kind of professional automatism in which the eyes registered and the hands responded without the mediation of active thought. This trained automatism was one of the most demanding things about the upper servant's work. To be perfectly responsive while appearing perfectly still, to be a human presence that functions like a machine while remaining, below the trained surface, entirely human, required a sustained effort of will and self-discipline that was invisible by design. The best footmen appeared effortless. Their movements at the table were smooth and quiet. The removal of a plate so noiseless as to seem like a conjuring trick. The refilling of a glass accomplished between one breath and the next, without the guest having consciously registered the interruption to their conversation. This art of invisibility was taught, though never in any formal curriculum. It was taught by observation, watching the older footman, understanding through example what was expected, what was permissible, what would draw a rebuke from the butler's quietly expressive look. It was taught by repetition, performing the same service so many hundreds of times that it became bodily knowledge rather than mental, the hands knowing where to be before the mind had processed the visual information. And it was reinforced by the clear knowledge of consequence. A dropped plate, a spilled wine, a too audible step on the dining room floor, these were failures visible to everyone, failures that would be discussed with the butler afterward, failures that left a mark on the record of professional competence that determined whether your position was secure or uncertain. The housekeeper's authority extended to the guest rooms when visitors were in the house, and the preparation of a guest room was a particular expression of Victorian domestic standards at their most concentrated. Everything in a guest room had to be perfect, because a guest was an outsider, someone whose opinion of the household was fresh and uncompromised by familiarity, someone who would notice what the family had long ceased to see. The fire had to draw perfectly. The water in the ewer had to be hot. The towels had to be the finest the house possessed. The small writing desk in the corner had to be equipped with the correct stationery, ink, pens, and blotting paper, arranged in their proper relationships. The mirror had to be positioned at the ideal angle for use at the dressing table. And the bed. The Victorian guest bed, made to its proper standard, was an architectural achievement. The mattress laid correctly, the undersheet pulled drum-tight across its surface, the top sheet folded down with a precise measured turnback at its upper edge, the pillows in their cases arranged with their open ends facing away from the door. The bed cover, whatever it might be, whether a heavy silk counterpane or a lighter summer coverlet, laid with its pattern centred, its edges hanging to an equal distance on both sides. A hot water bottle, on cold nights, inserted between the sheets to take the chill from the linen, a small consideration that a thoughtful housekeeper would think of without being asked, because thinking ahead was part of her professional identity. All of this was done by invisible hands. The guest who arrived in the evening to find their room in this perfect state of readiness did not think about the work that had produced it. That was the point. The invisibility of the preparation was itself a form of the service. The illusion maintained that the world arranged itself beautifully without effort, that the warm room and the perfect bed were simply the natural state of things, not the result of hours of skilled physical labour by another human being. Every Victorian household ran on hierarchy. This was true of the family upstairs, of course. The whole elaborate machinery of Victorian class was a hierarchy, a structure of rank and precedence that governed everything from where you sat at dinner party, to whether you were addressed as Sir or Mr., to what you wore and where you worshipped and whom you married. But below stairs, the hierarchy was if anything even more formally defined, even more rigorously observed. At the top of the female servant hierarchy stood the housekeeper. She was often a woman of middle age, experienced, sober, capable, trusted. In large country houses she might be addressed as Mrs., regardless of whether she'd ever been married, the honorific a mark of her status rather than her marital history. She kept the household linen and the store cupboard. She was responsible for the cleaning of the house, managing the housemaids who carried it out. She handled certain household accounts, ordering supplies, managing inventories of china and glass, overseeing the care of the family's possessions. The housekeeper's room was her domain, a sitting room of sorts, furnished a little better than the servants' hall proper, where she might take her meals with the upper servants and receive tradespeople and deal with the correspondence related to the household. It was a room that spoke of authority and a certain modest dignity, and the housekeeper herself embodied both those qualities. She was the buffer between the family's expectations and the servants' capacity to meet them, and she held that position with a kind of professional gravity. Below the housekeeper, the housemaids formed their own internal hierarchy: head housemaid, under housemaid, and, in larger establishments, one or more additional housemaids whose duties were confined to the less prestigious rooms or more tedious tasks. The head housemaid directed the others, assigned tasks, reported to the housekeeper, and was responsible for the overall cleanliness and order of the house's living spaces. The bedrooms were cleaned to a precise routine. Beds were made to a precise specification. Chamber pots were emptied and rinsed and set back in their cabinets. Dressing tables were dusted and polished. Mirrors were cleaned without leaving streaks. Carpets were swept with a long-handled brush, working in careful overlapping strokes from the edges of the room toward the centre, then rolled and beaten when the more thorough seasonal cleaning came around. Each room had its list of duties. Each room had its allocated time. The housemaid who fell behind her schedule would find the next task pressing in before the last was complete, and there was no good solution to that. Only the hurried, slightly anxious acceleration of hands moving faster, and duster, moving more quickly over surfaces that deserved more careful attention. The kitchen hierarchy was separate from the housekeeping hierarchy, and no less precise. At its apex stood the cook, known in the grandest houses as the cook-housekeeper, where her authority extended further, or simply as cook, a title that carried weight by itself. Under her served the kitchen maid, responsible for the more preparatory and secondary cooking tasks, making stocks and sauces, preparing vegetables, assisting with the baking. Below the kitchen maid, the scullery maid, as we have already seen, occupied the most junior and most demanding position of all. In very large establishments, the great country houses of the aristocracy, where staff might number 40 or 50, there were additional specializations. A still-room maid worked in the still-room, a small kitchen-adjacent space where jams and preserves were made, cakes baked, coffee and tea prepared. A laundry maid worked in the laundry, managing the enormous weekly labour of washing and starching and ironing the household linen. A dairymaid, If the house had a dairy, tended the cows and produced the butter and cream. And then there was the lady's maid. She occupied a peculiar position in the hierarchy, technically among the upper servants, close to her mistress in a way that no other servant was, privy to the most intimate details of her mistress's appearance and daily life. She dressed her hair, helped her dress and undress, cared for her clothes and jewellery, sometimes accompanied her on journeys, read to her in the evenings if required. This intimacy could breed a genuine fondness between mistress and maid. There are many Victorian letters that speak with warmth of a trusted maid's company, but it was always an intimacy bounded by the absolute clarity of their respective positions. The lady's maid served at her mistress's pleasure, and her mistress's pleasure could change. The male servants had their own parallel hierarchy. Butler at the top, his authority extending over the footmen and sometimes the outdoor staff as well. Below him, the footmen in their various ranks. And then, in households that could afford them, the hallboy, a young man at the very bottom of the male servant ladder, whose duties were as tedious as the scullery maids, cleaning boots, carrying coal, answering the back door, performing whatever small and tiresome tasks no one higher up wished to do. Outside the house proper, the outdoor staff formed another category entirely: head groom, under grooms, coachmen, stable boys, gardeners, and the men who maintained the grounds. The head groom managed the horses and carriages, a responsibility of considerable importance in a period before the motor car. The horses required constant care, feeding, grooming, exercising. The carriages required maintenance and cleaning. The coachman drove the family wherever they wished to go, sitting up on the box in all weathers, waiting in all weathers while the family conducted their visits and attended their engagements. The gardeners were often somewhat separate from the domestic servants, closer to the outdoor world of soil and season, their rhythms governed less by the bellboard and more by the weather and the growing calendar. A head gardener in a great establishment was a figure of genuine expertise and status, his kitchen garden supplying the house with vegetables and fruit, his formal gardens displaying the cultivated beauty that visitors admired. The relationship between kitchen and garden was a close one. The cook relied on the gardener's produce, and the gardener received feedback on what the kitchen most needed. And underpinning all of it, the whole elaborate interlocking structure of Victorian service, was a set of expectations so thoroughly understood on all sides that they rarely needed to be stated. You knew your position. You knew what was expected of you. You knew the boundaries of your authority, the limits of your freedom, the precise degree of deference owed to those above you and claimed from those below. This was not always comfortable. It was not always fair, but it was, in its way, a complete world, with its own rules and rewards, its own friendships and rivalries, its own private joys and sorrows played out in the spaces between the work. The lady's maid occupied a position in the household that was, in some ways, the most psychologically complex of all the servants' roles. She was in intimate attendance on one person, her mistress, from the moment that person woke to the moment she retired, and the intimacy of that attendance created a relationship unlike any other in the household. She knew her mistress's body as well as any person alive, knew the state of her health by the colour in her face when the morning curtains were drawn back, knew the quality of her mood by the way she sat at the dressing table while her hair was arranged, knew the small physical habits and preferences and aversions that a person reveals only to those who attend to them daily. This knowledge was power, in a sense, the power of intimate information, the power of being trusted with a person's most unguarded moments. But it was a power that could not be exercised or even acknowledged. A lady's maid who used her knowledge of her mistress's private affairs for any purpose other than silent, devoted service was a lady's maid who had violated the foundational premise of her position. The trust was total, and the expectation of discretion was equally total. There were ladies' maids who became genuine confidants to their mistresses, women in whom the mistress placed not just professional confidence, but personal trust, to whom she spoke in moments of distress or uncertainty or joy, with whom she formed something that resembled, without quite being, friendship. Victorian literature and social history both document these relationships. The mistress who could not imagine managing without her maid, who wrote warmly of her in letters to family members, who secured her future in her will. But the asymmetry was never fully dissolved. The lady's maid could listen, could comfort, could offer the quiet companionship of her presence, but she could not share her own troubles in return. The relationship flowed in one direction, and both women understood this. The dressing of a Victorian lady of fashion was in itself a daily performance of considerable complexity. The undergarments alone, chemise, corset cover, petticoats, required careful handling and a skilled hand with the corset's laces, which had to be drawn to achieve the fashionable silhouette without producing the genuine physical distress that improperly fitted corsets could cause. The outer dress, fastened at the back with a long row of tiny hooks and eyes or buttons, required 2 pairs of hands to manage properly. The hair, which in the 1870s and 1880s involved elaborate arrangements of curls, chignons and supplementary hairpieces, might take half an hour to achieve on a formal occasion. The lady's maid possessed a technical knowledge of fashion that rivaled that of any dressmaker. She understood which fabrics needed particular care in laundering, which dyes were vulnerable to light or moisture, which garments needed to be stored in which conditions to preserve them. She repaired the tiny damage of daily wear, a loosened button, a seam that had started to give, a piece of trimming that needed reattaching. She maintained the mistress's jewellery, ensuring that it was clean and stored correctly, that the clasps were secure and the setting sound. When the family travelled, the lady's maid travelled with them. This meant packing the mistress's entire wardrobe in a systematic and logical way that would allow any item to be found and produced quickly on arrival, managing the unpacking and rehanging and pressing of garments at whatever destination was reached, adapting to different domestic arrangements in country houses or continental hotels or seaside lodgings. Travel revealed the lady's maid's competence in its fullest dimension, away from the familiar resources of the home establishment, with unfamiliar laundries and strange ironing arrangements and the disruption of journeys. She had to produce the same impeccable results she produced at home. The valet's parallel world was somewhat more straightforwardly practical. Men's fashion, in the Victorian period, was less elaborate than women's, but no less exacting. The gentleman's clothes were maintained to a standard of perfection that required daily attention. Suits were brushed after each wearing, hung correctly, stored in conditions that preserved their shape. Trousers were pressed with a crease of knife blade sharpness, so precisely rendered that you could have run your finger along it without risk of deviation. Boots, as we have seen, were polished to mirrors. Hats were brushed with a long-handled brush in the direction of the nap, the brim kept flat and even. The valet also managed the gentleman's bathroom, preparing the morning shaving water at exactly the right temperature, laying out the shaving equipment in its correct arrangement, ensuring that the razor was stropped to its proper keenness. The morning shave was, for many Victorian gentlemen, an attended ritual rather than a solitary one. The valet performing the shaving as well as preparing for it, the master sitting in the chair while the skilled hands moved over his face with a safety margin that depended entirely on the valet's steady precision. These intimate personal services, dressing, shaving, bathing arrangements, created a domestic dependence that could become quite profound. A gentleman who had been attended by the same valet for 20 years might find himself quite unable to dress independently with any confidence. The knowledge of which buttons went first, how to tie his own cravat to the correct degree of elegance, how to achieve the particular arrangement of his hair that suited him. All of this had been in the valet's keeping for so long that the master had ceased to hold it himself. This was not negligence. It was the natural result of a system designed to produce exactly this kind of reliance. The housekeeper's relationship with the junior housemaids had its own particular dynamic, one that combined the authority of an employer with something closer to the responsibility of a teacher, or even a surrogate parent. Many of the girls who came into service were very young, 14, sometimes younger in earlier decades of the period, and they came from backgrounds that had given them little preparation for the specific demands of domestic work in a large household. They needed training, not just instruction. They needed to learn not only the tasks themselves, but the professional attitudes and disciplines that made the tasks achievable, the sustained attention, the quiet pride in work done to a high standard, the management of tiredness and tedium without letting it show. A good housekeeper invested genuinely in this training. She corrected mistakes patiently and specifically, not with the vague criticism of "that's not right," but with the precise guidance of the dust should be moved from the surface downward, not upward, because it settles from above. She noticed when a girl was developing skill and said so, because recognition given at the right moment was worth more than any amount of general approval. She was strict about the things that could not be compromised, cleanliness, punctuality, discretion, and somewhat more flexible about the things that were matters of style or preference. The relationship was not always easy. There were housekeepers who were tyrannical, whose authority expressed itself in petty cruelty or unreasonable demand. There were housemaids who were difficult, sulky, or simply unsuited to the work. But in the best cases, the relationship produced something valuable. Young women who left service after 5 or 10 years not only more skilled at practical tasks, but more capable in a dozen less tangible ways, more organised, more reliable, more attuned to the needs of others, more comfortable with complexity and responsibility. At the heart of the below-stairs world was the servants' hall. It was a room of considerable size in most houses. A long table down its middle, benches and chairs along the sides, a fireplace at one end, a dresser along one wall bearing the everyday crockery used by the staff. The walls were plainly painted or whitewashed. The floor was stone or bare wood, perhaps covered with a strip of oilcloth or a worn drugget carpet in the colder months. The room smelled of food and coal smoke and the faint underlying dampness that belonged to any underground space, and it was lit, during the evening hours when the staff gathered here, by oil lamps or, in more modern establishments, by early gas fittings that cast a steadier light than candles but still left the corners in a comfortable dimness. This was where the servants took their meals, and the meals themselves were, again, governed by hierarchy. The upper servant sat at the head of the table nearest the fireplace. The butler, the housekeeper, the lady's maid, the valet, the head cook, if she chose to eat with the staff rather than in her own kitchen. These were the privileged places. At the far end of the table sat the youngest, most junior staff, and between them ranged everyone else in their exact and understood order. The food at the servants' table was good, by Victorian working-class standards. Better, certainly, than most of the servants would have eaten at home. A typical servant's dinner might be a roast with potatoes and vegetables, or a substantial stew, or cold meat from the previous day's joint made into a pie. There would be bread and butter. There would be tea in enormous quantities. On special occasions, a wedding in the family, a large house party, the servants' table might see wines and delicacies from the kitchen that would not otherwise come their way. But meals in the servants' hall had their own formalities. When a senior servant entered, the others were expected to rise. Conversation was expected to be civil. Complaints about the family were considered very bad form indeed, not because they never occurred, but because the conventions of the table required a certain surface discretion. What was said in private, in the small rooms and corridors away from the communal table, was another matter. The evenings in the servants' hall were the social heart of the below-stairs world. After dinner was cleared and the washing up was done, after the footman had brought in the family's evening tray and the butler had checked the locks, there was a period of what passed for leisure. The fire burned. Someone might read aloud from a newspaper. Someone else might be sewing, mending the household linens, or working on their own small tasks. There might be cards if the upper servants permitted it. There might be conversation, the relaxed, comfortable talk of people who had spent long hours together and knew each other's rhythms and habits well. The relationships formed in the servants' hall were often among the deepest and most sustaining of these individuals' lives. They were far from home. Most domestic servants had come from somewhere else, from other counties or other towns, from farms and cottages and small houses, and the people with whom they worked were the people with whom they lived. Friendships made in service were often lifelong. A young housemaid who entered a household at 14 and served in it through her 20s formed bonds with the other servants that were as strong as family. There were rivalries too, of course, the natural friction of people living at close quarters with no means of escape. But these existed alongside, not instead of, the genuine affection and solidarity that the shared life of service could produce. There was singing in the servants' hall on quiet evenings, not formal music, but the kind of casual, informal singing that was simply what people did in that era before recorded sound, someone beginning a song that others knew, voices joining in, a familiar tune filling the room for a few minutes before the conversation resumed. Victorian popular songs, hymn tunes, traditional airs from the various counties and regions the servants came from. The housemaid from Somerset might bring her county's ballads to the table. The footman from Scotland might know reels and laments that nobody else had heard. The cook, if she was in a good mood and had had a glass of something restorative after the effort of a large dinner, might surprise everyone with a voice of unexpected quality and range. There were rules about the servants' hall that were never written down but were perfectly well understood. You did not bring your private grievances to the communal table. You did not question the housekeeper's decisions within earshot of the junior staff. You did not form attachments to members of the family. This was perhaps the most absolute of the unwritten rules, the one whose violation could end a career and damage a reputation. You maintained the separation that was the foundation of the whole system, and you did so not always because you agreed with it, but because it was the condition of the life you were living. And yet, for all the rules and all the constraints, the servants' hall was also, in its best hours, a place of warmth, a place where the day's fatigue could be set aside, a place where you could be known and recognized and valued for something other than your work, a place where the fire was warm and the tea was strong, and the hours, for a little while, belonged to you. The servants' hall was the site of a particular kind of storytelling. Below stairs, in the evenings and in the quieter hours of the day, stories circulated with the ease of an oral tradition. Stories about the family, stories about previous employers, stories about the world beyond the house, stories about the servants themselves. These were not written down mostly. They were told and retold, shaped by each telling, accumulated into a shared body of household lore that the newest arrivals absorbed and the longest-serving members maintained. Stories about the family had to be handled with care. There were professional conventions that bounded them. The understanding that private family matters did not leave the house, that what was discussed below stairs did not become gossip in the outside world. But within those conventions there was a lively and sometimes quite sharp-eyed commentary on the people the servants worked for. The idiosyncrasies of family members were known and catalogued with some precision. The master's habit of ringing twice before he'd actually made up his mind what he wanted. The mistress's tendency to change the flower arrangement in the hall without warning, requiring a rapid reconstitution of whatever the gardener had just delivered. The young lady's habit of leaving her gloves in the most inconvenient possible places and then requiring them at 10 minutes' notice. These observations were not malicious mostly. They were the observations of professionals about the people who generated their work. The same kind of careful attention to individual habit that any skilled professional develops about the clients or customers whose specific needs shape their practice. The cook who knew that the master preferred his lamb slightly underdone and his fish very well done was exercising a professional knowledge of individual preference that was also, inescapably, a knowledge of the master as a person. The footman who knew that the mistress always needed a glass of water beside her at table, never whine, and would not ask for it but would be discomfited throughout the meal if it was not there. He was carrying a piece of knowledge about her that was both professional and intimate. This intimate professional knowledge was also, in some cases, a form of power, a quiet, mostly unexercised power, but real. The servant who knew that the master was in financial difficulties because the housekeeper had let slip to the butler that the coal order had been reduced, who knew that the family's guest this weekend was not a friend but a creditor, who could read the mood of the household from the quality of the dinners and the frequency of visitors. This servant held information that could, in principle, be used in ways that would be damaging. That it mostly was not used that way, that the conventions of professional discretion were mostly respected, that the information circulated below stairs but not out into the world, was a matter of honour in a system that had few mechanisms to enforce it. There were also, in the servants' hall, the stories of other houses. Servants who had worked in multiple positions over the course of their careers brought with them the accumulated anecdotes of those other households. The great house in the country where the butler had been a celebrated drunk, impeccably professional until 5 in the evening, and thereafter unreliable. The London establishment where the cook had had an arrangement with a local butcher that involved certain financial considerations not included in the household accounts. The family where the eldest son was known below stairs to be considerably more interested in the footmen than in the daughters of the neighbouring families his mother kept inviting to dinner. These stories were told with a mixture of amusement, commiseration, and the professional satisfaction of people who considered themselves to be in a better position than those described. There was a clear hierarchy of desirable households, understood through the informal network of servant stories and registry office reputations, and being in a good house, a house where the work was fair, the food adequate, the upper servants decent, the family considerate, was a position worth protecting and worth knowing that you were in. The registry office occupied an important position in this network. It was a service through which householders seeking servants and servants seeking positions could be matched, a kind of organised clearinghouse for the labour market in domestic service. Servants were registered there with their references and their history of positions. Employers registered their vacancies with their requirements and their terms. The registry office keeper was a person of some significance in the domestic labour market, possessing knowledge of both supply and demand and a reputation for the quality of her recommendations that was her principal professional asset. For a servant, a good reference from a previous employer was among the most important possessions she had. References were the currency of advancement in domestic service. A glowing testimonial from a respected family could open doors that no amount of personal charm or professional skill alone could move, and a bad reference, or worse, no reference at all, was nearly catastrophic. A servant dismissed without a character reference was effectively cut off from the legitimate domestic labour market, forced to take whatever position she could find without the protection of institutional endorsement. This dependence on references gave employers a significant power over their servants, and it was a power that was not always used responsibly. A servant who had displeased her employer, not through any professional failing, but through personal friction, or through an inadvertent witness to something the employer wished concealed, or simply through being found personally annoying, might find herself unable to secure another position, because the character given by that employer was damning or deliberately equivocal. There were no formal appeals, no regulatory oversight, no mechanism by which the servant could challenge an unjust reference. The system was vulnerable to abuse, and it was sometimes abused. This vulnerability was part of the larger precarity that underlaid the domestic servant's life, however comfortable the surface appeared. The position, the room, the meals, the small securities of employment, all of it was contingent on the continued goodwill of the employer. A sudden change in the family's circumstances, a financial reversal, a death, a marriage, a decision to reduce the household, could end a position that had seemed permanent, with a month's notice and a reference that opened or closed future possibilities depending on the departing employer's sense of fairness. Servants who had been in a position for many years, who had grown old in a household, who had given their working life to a family and were in some ways the most vulnerable. The longer the service, the more completely the servant's life was invested in that particular household, and the fewer the options if it ended. The housekeeper, who had served a family for 30 years and found herself given notice at 50, was facing a labour market that was not particularly interested in women of her age, however distinguished her record. This was known. It was part of the consciousness of domestic service, held in the back of the mind even in the most secure and pleasant positions, the awareness that security was not guaranteed, that the continuity of the comfortable routines that filled the days was dependent on factors outside one's own control. And yet, people stayed. They stayed because the known difficulties of their present situation were preferable to the unknown difficulties of changing. They stayed because the work was familiar and the people were known. They stayed because the house had become, in some meaningful sense, home, and home is not easily abandoned, even when the title to it belongs to someone else. Let us follow each single day more closely. Let us move through its hours with the same attention we would give to water moving through a channel, noticing the way it quickens here, slows there, pools in the quieter passages and rushes forward in the busy ones. It is a Tuesday in late October. The great house sits on the edge of a provincial city, a substantial red brick manor house set in grounds that include a formal garden, a kitchen garden, a stable yard, and a ha-ha wall that separates the domesticated space of the grounds from the open fields beyond. The leaves on the copper beech at the end of the drive have turned to a deep tarnished bronze, and the mornings have acquired the sharp mineral chill that means autumn has fully arrived. The household consists of the family, the master, his wife, their 2 adult daughters and a visiting relation, and the staff, who number 16 in total: butler, housekeeper, 2 footmen, cook, kitchen maid, scullery maid, head housemaid, 2 under housemaids, lady's maid, a nursery maid looking after a young grandchild of the house, coachman, groom, gardener and hall boy. The hall boy rises at 5:15. He is 16, gap-toothed and good-humoured, the youngest member of the household staff and the holder of the most thankless collection of duties. His first task this morning is the boots. He carries them from outside the bedroom doors where they were left overnight. 8 pairs, each needing to be cleaned and polished to a specific standard, down to the boot room in the basement, where he sets to work with his brushes and his boot polish, and the horsehair cloth that works the polish to a shine. Boot cleaning was an art form by Victorian standards. A gentleman's boots had to be polished to a mirror finish, the leather supple and dark without streak or blemish. Ladies' shoes were handled more carefully, their more delicate materials requiring lighter treatment. The boot room smelled permanently and powerfully of leather and polish, and the particular sharp chemical scent of the blacking compound. And the hall boy spent an hour here each morning, his hands gradually blackening, his arms aching with the circular motion of buffing cloth against leather. By 6:30 the housemaids are at work in the reception rooms. The fires laid earlier are burning well now, the rooms warming. The dusting follows a precise sequence, work from the highest surfaces downward, so that the dust disturbed from the mantelpiece settles on the shelves below, and the dust from the shelves settles on the furniture, and the dust from the furniture settles on the floor, and the floor is swept last. This logic of dust, its slow inevitable descent, governed all the cleaning of Victorian interiors, and a housemaid who disturbed it worked against the natural order of the task. The dining room required particular care on a Tuesday, because Tuesday was the day when the family's large social calendar was likely to begin filling toward the weekend. The long mahogany table was polished with beeswax. The chairs were checked for wobbles and loose joints. The fireplace here was the most formal in the house, its marble surround requiring a particular cleaning paste that left it white and bright. The sideboard with its array of decanters and serving pieces was dusted with a particular carefulness about the glass. In the kitchen, the cook has been at work since 6. She's making preparations for the day's meals, breakfast of course, but also planning the luncheon and the dinner, the latter requiring the most careful advance work. The morning's breakfast preparation is straightforward. The range produces its heat, the kidneys are grilling, the kedgeree is warming, the bread is cut and the toast racks are filled. The cook moves between tasks with the efficient, economical motion of someone who has performed these same actions so many thousands of times that they have become a form of bodily memory as automatic as breathing. At 8 o'clock the family begins to come down. This is signalled not by any announcement but by the sounding of the dressing bell, a servant ringing through the house to indicate that the time for dressing has come and that breakfast will be ready shortly. The footmen take their positions in the dining room. The butler checks the table one final time with the practised eye of a general surveying his troops before engagement. Everything is in order. The family's breakfast proceeds with the unhurried luxury of those for whom time is a managed resource rather than a consumed one. They eat, they read the morning papers, they discuss their plans for the day. A letter is brought in on a silver salver, a visiting card is received, a note is dispatched by the footman to an address across town. The mechanisms of upper-class life tick smoothly forward. Below stairs, breakfast is rather different. The servants eat before the family or after. The timing varies by household. At the long table in the servants' hall, a substantial meal of bread and dripping or fried bread, tea in large mugs, perhaps a slice of cold meat, or some of the same bacon that had been prepared for upstairs in a slightly less careful presentation. The conversation is livelier at the servants' breakfast than at the family's, less constrained. The day is being talked through, the tasks allocated, the small frictions of yesterday's work processed and set aside. After the family's breakfast, the clearing up is its own ritual. The footmen clear the table with a practised efficiency, stacking dishes onto the trolley for transport back to the kitchen, folding the used napkins, relaying the table for the mid-morning refreshments that the family might require. The kitchen receives the dishes and the breakfast debris, and the cook assesses what has been eaten and what has been left, and adjusts the day's kitchen ordering accordingly. Mid-morning brings the housemaids to the bedrooms. This is the major cleaning operation of the day, beds stripped and remade with the particular military precision that a good Victorian housemaid brought to the task, fresh water brought to the washstands, chamber pots dealt with, floors swept, curtains opened and windows adjusted according to the temperature and the weather outside. The personal rooms of the family were spaces the servants knew as intimately as the family members themselves, knew the way the morning light fell on a particular surface, knew which drawer stuck and required a gentle downward pressure before it would open, knew the smell and feel of each room as its own particular atmosphere. This intimacy of knowledge, knowing the physical spaces of another person's life in such minute and sensory detail, was one of the stranger aspects of domestic service. The housemaid who cleaned a bedroom every day knew it more thoroughly than the person who slept in it. She knew where the dust gathered first, what the light looked like at each time of day, how the room sounded when it was empty. She carried this knowledge as part of the working body, the professional body that moved through the house performing its services. And yet it was a knowledge without possession or claim. The room belonged to someone else. She was a visitor in it, however regular and however intimate her visits. The afternoon stretched differently, depending on whether the family was receiving visitors or spending the day quietly. On a quiet afternoon, the senior servants might find an hour for their own affairs, correspondence, mending, the reading of whatever book or journal they could find. The junior servants had less latitude, more likely to be found at ongoing tasks like the polishing of silver or the starching and ironing of table linens. The laundry was its own vast enterprise, conducted on specified days of the week in the laundry building to the side of the main house, the air there always thick with steam and the sharp scent of soap. As the afternoon light began to fail and the lamps were lit in the passages and the family's rooms, the house entered its evening mode. The footman lit the gas or oil lamps in the reception rooms, the butler checked the wine for the evening meal, the cook entered the final decisive hours of dinner preparation. The art of making bread in the Victorian kitchen was a daily or near-daily act of considerable skill and patience. In houses where the bread was made rather than purchased, and in large country houses this was almost always the case, the kitchen maid or the cook herself would begin the process the night before, setting the yeast to work in a bowl of warm water and flour, the mixture kept in a warm spot near the range through the night, so that by morning it was alive and ready to begin its work on the main dough. The bread was mixed in a large, shallow wooden trough, the bread trough or dough trough, that sat on its own low legs in the kitchen, its interior worn smooth by generations of use. The flour was turned out into it, the yeast mixture added, and then the work of kneading began. This was hard physical work, involving the whole weight of the body bearing down on the dough, the hands pushing and folding and turning in a rhythm that needed to be sustained for 15 or 20 minutes. Long enough for the gluten to develop, for the dough to transform from a shaggy, reluctant mass into something smooth and elastic and faintly warm under the hands. After the kneading, the dough rested. This was the patience part, the willingness to wait for the living thing in the dough to do its own work, to rise in its own time, which could not be hurried but only managed. The kitchen had learned this patience. The cook who tried to force bread through its rising too quickly or too slowly produced results that the family would notice, and she knew it. The bread that came to the table was part of the daily statement of the kitchen's competence, and bread that was heavy or dense or unevenly risen was a small but real failure. Pastry was made on the marble slab, a piece of cold stone built into the kitchen's work surface expressly for this purpose, the coolness of the marble keeping the fat in the pastry from melting prematurely as it was worked. Cold hands were an advantage for pastry. A cook who naturally ran warm would know to rinse her wrists under the cold tap before beginning. The pastry for a pie or a tart was rolled with a particular efficiency, not too many passes of the rolling pin, not too much pressure, the whole thing done quickly to prevent overworking the gluten, and then lifted with a care that acknowledged its fragility. The thin sheet of dough draping over the rolling pin for transport to the waiting dish. These kitchen arts were transmitted person to person, cook to kitchen maid, in an apprenticeship that was as practical and embodied as any craft training. You learned bread by making bread hundreds of times until your hands knew what the dough was telling you. You learned pastry the same way. You learned the point at which a sauce had reduced sufficiently, not by measuring but by reading it with your eyes and the back of your spoon. You learned the smell of a joint that needed 15 more minutes versus a joint that needed to come out now. The kitchen education was an education of the senses, and it took years to complete. The confectionery arts were even more demanding. Sugar work, the making of pulled sugar decorations, spun sugar baskets, crystallized flowers, required a precision of temperature management that was entirely manual in the Victorian kitchen, before sugar thermometers had become standard. The cook working with hot sugar watched its behaviour in the pan, the thread stage, the soft ball, the hard ball, the soft crack, the hard crack, each determined by dropping a small amount into cold water and reading the result. This knowledge was exact and perishable. A moment's inattention could take sugar from the perfect stage through to irretrievable burning in seconds. Jellies were made from calves' feet or from isinglass, a clarifying agent made from dried fish bladders, and the process of producing a Victorian jelly was a multi-day affair of considerable labour. The stock boiled from the bones or the isinglass, strained and strained again through a jelly bag until it ran clear as water, then flavoured and coloured and poured into moulds that had been soaked in cold water to facilitate unmoulding. The resulting jelly, turned out onto a dish of suitable grandeur, was one of the showpieces of the Victorian sweet table, quivering, brilliant, its colour jewel-bright under the candlelight. The table on which all this appeared was itself a kind of theatre. The Victorian dining table, set for a formal dinner, was a composition as deliberate as any painting. The silver and glass arranged in a specific vocabulary of order, the flowers in their centrepiece chosen for colour and form, the china plates positioned with their patterns orientated in a consistent direction, the napkins folded in elaborate forms, swans, mitres, bishops' caps, that expressed an ideal of hospitality both lavish and controlled. The footman who folded the napkins had usually learned the required forms from the butler, who had learned them from a predecessor, in a chain of transmission that reached back through the decades, to whoever had first decided that a napkin folded into the shape of a water lily was the appropriate accompaniment to a formal dinner. These forms were catalogued in household manuals and illustrated in the domestic encyclopedias that every Victorian housekeeper kept on her shelf, but they were really known through the hands. Through the practice of folding and refolding, until the muscle memory was reliable enough to produce a perfect bishop's mitre every time in the 5 minutes before dinner service began. The wine, brought from the cellar at the butler's direction, was decanted in the butler's pantry when the wine required it. Decanting was both a practical and a ceremonial act. Practically, it separated the wine from any sediment that had accumulated in the bottle during storage and allowed the wine to breathe, to lose the closed, slightly reductive quality that long-bottled wine could develop, and to open into its full character. Ceremonially, it transferred the wine from its commercial container into the household's own glass decanters, crystal vessels that were themselves beautiful objects, their faceted surfaces catching and returning the candlelight in small repetitions of brilliance. The butler held the candle behind the neck of the bottle as he poured, watching for the first trace of sediment to reach the neck and stopping the pour at that moment, leaving the last half-inch of wine in the bottle rather than clouding the decanted wine with what had settled. This was a skill of observation, of reading colour and clarity through glass, that was also a kind of intimacy with the wine itself, a sustained attention to its nature and its needs that was entirely consistent with the larger ethic of domestic service. In the kitchen, as the evening advanced, the cook's full attention narrowed to the approaching dinner with an intensity that was partly professional concentration and partly something almost meditative. The kitchen was at its most fully alive in these final hours before service, the heat considerable, the smells complex and layered, the movements of the cook and her assistants rapid and exact. The difference between a kitchen operating at its peak and one that was merely competent was visible in these moments, in the precision of the timing, in the economy of movement, in the quality of the cook's calm, the way she managed the multiple streams of preparation with a clear internal priority that kept everything in its correct relationship to the whole. The great dinner was also, always, a negotiation with uncertainty. Things could go wrong. A sauce could break at the wrong moment. An oven could run too hot and a joint could go beyond its intended degree. A soufflé could refuse to rise. These disasters were part of the cook's consciousness throughout the preparation, not as sources of anxiety mostly, but as possibilities to be managed against, risks that professional skill reduced but never entirely eliminated. The cook who had never had a dinner go wrong was a cook who had not been cooking long enough. When things did go wrong, the response was what distinguished the professional from the amateur. The broken sauce was quickly repaired or quietly replaced with something adjacent. The overdone joint was carved to conceal the evidence of excessive heat. The failed soufflé was replaced by a dish that had been kept in reserve against exactly this contingency, because a good cook always had a contingency, something that could appear on the table without the family being aware that what they were eating was not what they had been intended to eat. This was the cook's private theatre, the constant management of what the family saw against the reality of what had happened to produce it. It was, in miniature, the larger theatre of domestic service itself, the impeccable surface, the invisible struggle, the gap between the perfect result and the imperfect process that produced it. Of all the daily rituals in a Victorian household, none was more elaborate, more charged with social significance, or more demanding of the servant's collective skill than dinner. Dinner was not simply a meal, it was a performance. It was the demonstration, repeated every evening, that this household maintained the standards appropriate to its station. The number of courses, the quality of the food, the polish of the silver, the arrangement of the flowers, the precision with which the footmen moved between the places, all of it was visible to any guest at the table, all of it subject to the quiet judgment of people who knew exactly what a dinner of this kind should look like, and who would notice any departure from that standard. The preparation began hours before the family sat down. The cook's afternoon was devoted to it. Sauces made from long-simmered stocks that filled the kitchen with their deep, complex aromas. Pastry cases baked to a precise golden colour, ready to receive their fillings. Fish poached in a court bouillon, the liquid reduced afterward to a source of concentrated flavour. Joints of meat going into and coming out of the oven, according to a timetable of remarkable precision. The cook kept the timing in her head, in a mental schedule that tracked multiple dishes across multiple temperatures simultaneously. The kitchen maid worked alongside her, performing the secondary tasks, making the bread sauce, blanching and refreshing the vegetables, preparing the savouries that would come at the meal's end. The scullery maid washed as she always washed, the pots accumulating and diminishing in the water-filled sink, her hands in perpetual motion. The kitchen was hot, always hot by this hour, the range at full intensity, the oven doors opening and closing, the smells of roasting and sautéing and baking layering over one another in the air. The butler, meanwhile, was attending to the wine. The wine cellar was one of the house's more serious responsibilities, a cool, well-organised space where the bottles were stored on their sides in correct conditions, each one labelled, dated, catalogued. A good butler knew the cellars as a scholar knows his library, which vintages were ready to drink, which needed more time, which would partner the planned dishes for the evening. He brought the bottles up in advance, standing them in the pantry to come to room temperature if they were red, placing the whites in a cooler if they were white. The footmen were laying the table. This was a task of near military precision. The cloth laid first, drawn smooth and straight without a wrinkle. The dinner plates positioned at exact intervals, their edges aligned with the table's edge by the use of a ruler in the most formal houses. The cutlery laid in the correct order, fish knife and fork to the outside, soup spoon beyond them, the sequence working inward toward the plate as the courses advanced. The glasses arranged in their correct groupings above the knives. Water, white wine, red wine, perhaps a champagne flute if champagne was planned. The condiment sets, the butter dishes, the small dishes for salt, each in its appointed place, and the flowers. The centrepiece of a Victorian dinner table was a floral arrangement of considerable ambition, fresh flowers from the greenhouse or the kitchen garden, arranged in epergnes or low bowls that allowed conversation to proceed across them. The choice of flowers was its own language. White lilies spoke differently from red roses, which spoke differently from the humble country flowers of a summer garden. The lady of the house might have specific preferences. The gardener delivered, the flower room maid arranged, and the result was placed on the table where it would draw the eyes of the guests throughout the long evening. At 7 o'clock, or 8, depending on the household's custom, the family dressed for dinner. This was the most elaborate of the daily dressing rituals. For the women, a formal evening gown, the hair dressed up with particular care, jewellery chosen from the cases in the safe. The lady and the performance began. A formal Victorian dinner might run to 8 courses or more. Soup, fish, a remove, entrees, the joint, a game course, a sweet, savouries, dessert. Each course required its own service, its own choreography between the footman and the butler, its own timing relative to the kitchen below. A signal system existed. A bell from the dining room to the kitchen, pulled by the butler at the appropriate moment, answered by dishes arriving at the serving hatch, by which the kitchen's pace and the table's pace were kept in alignment. The conversation at the table was not of concern to the servants standing at its margins. They were supposed not to hear it, and in the professional sense they did not. The details of family affairs, political opinions, financial arrangements discussed at the dinner table passed through the servant's consciousness without being retained or acted upon, in the same way that a wallpaper pattern absorbs light without reflection. This trained non-hearing was another of the domestic servant's professional accomplishments, and it required a particular quality of attention, present enough to respond immediately to any request, absent enough to not be recording the content of what was said. The wine circulated. The courses succeeded one another. The candles on the table burned slowly down. Outside the tall dining room windows, the night was complete now, the grounds dark, the city beyond the park sending up its glow against the clouds. The household moved through the evening like a clock, each part turning in relation to every other part, the whole mechanism keeping its own time. After dinner, the family withdrew, the ladies to the drawing room, the gentlemen remaining at the table over port and cigars, and the servants, when the table was finally clear, when the last footsteps had sounded up the staircase. When the drawing-room bell had rung for the last tea-tray and been answered, the servants began the great clearing away. The plates and silver went to the pantry for washing. The wine glasses, their fragile bowls carrying the residue of the evening's vintages, went to the butler's care. The table was stripped and the cloth taken away. The fire in the dining room was banked. The gas lamps were turned down to their overnight glow. The public rooms of the house, so recently alive with the warmth of company, settled back into their quiet and formal shapes. Below stairs, the kitchen was at its last labours. The great cooking operation of the day was over. What remained was cleaning. The range had to be attended to, the pots and pans washed, the kitchen surfaces wiped down, the preparations made for morning. The cook, who had been on her feet since 6 a.m, moved through these final tasks with the economical energy of someone who had simply paced themselves across 12 or 13 hours. No faster now than she had been at noon, no slower either, just steady. Eventually, sometime after 10, sometimes much later, the house began to fall quiet. The family retired. The final bells were answered. The butler made his last round of the house, checking locks and windows, snuffing out the remaining lights. The footmen withdrew to their rooms. The housemaids, who had been sitting with their sewing in the servants' hall, put aside their work and carried their candles up the back stairs. One by one, the lights went out. The great house grew still, and the night settled over it like a cloak, dark and quiet and full of the soft sounds of a large building inhabited by sleeping people, the occasional creak of a settling beam, the distant call of an owl from the beech grove at the end of the garden, the slow and patient silence of a house at rest. The dining room in the evening was a world apart. Its proportions, higher ceilings than the family's private rooms, a grander fireplace, the long table that could accommodate 12 or 20 depending on the leaves inserted for the occasion, gave it a slightly formal quality even when it was empty, as though the room itself held the memory of all the dinners that had taken place within it, and was always, to some degree, in the attitude of expecting the next one. The candles on the table, in their branching candelabra of polished silver, produced a quality of light quite different from the gas or oil of the rooms the family used for ordinary life. Candlelight was warmer, more mobile, more flattering. It moved with every breath, every door opening, every slight current in the room, and in that movement it animated the scene, giving the silver and the glass a life that fixed light could not produce. The reflections in a wine glass by candlelight were not static but alive, and the faces of the people sitting around the table were lit with the particular softness that made the Victorians associate candlelight with beauty and intimacy. The conversation at a Victorian dinner table followed its own conventions, and these conventions were as carefully managed as everything else about the occasion. The hostess directed the conversation, setting topics, guiding transitions between subjects, ensuring that the quieter guests were drawn out and the more voluble ones did not dominate too completely. This was a social art that required considerable skill and experience, and it was as much a product of training and practice as the cook's mastery of the kitchen or the housekeeper's management of the household. The topics that were appropriate at dinner, and those that were not, were well understood. Politics was acceptable in most households, at least the moderate discussion of party positions. Violent partisanship was bad form. Literature was welcome. The novels and poetry of the day provided a safe common ground. Art and music were legitimate topics in houses where these were cultivated. What was not appropriate was anything too personal, too embarrassing, too contentious, too raw. The dinner table was a public space, even in its most private form, and the conventions of public discourse applied. The servants present in the room during dinner existed in a disciplined state of non-hearing that allowed the conversation to proceed as if they were not there. This was maintained by both sides, the family conducting their conversation without explicit reference to the servants' presence, the servants maintaining an expression and posture that indicated complete detachment from the content of what was being said. In practice, of course, the servants heard everything. But the professional training that governed their behaviour meant that what they heard was not supposed to exist in any form outside the room, was not to be repeated, not to be acted on, not to be carried below stairs as anecdote or gossip. This convention was a fiction, and both parties understood it as a fiction. The servants heard and they remembered, and they talked, discreetly, among themselves, with the care appropriate to people whose positions depended on their being trusted. But the fiction of non-hearing was also a functional necessity, without which the dinner table could not have functioned as a space of relatively free social exchange. The family could not have spoken openly among themselves if they had genuinely believed every word was being catalogued for below-stairs circulation. So the fiction was maintained, and the system worked, and the dinner proceeded. After the ladies withdrew, leaving the gentlemen to their port and their more unguarded conversation, the atmosphere in the dining room shifted perceptibly. The women's presence had imposed a degree of decorum that its removal now relaxed. The conversation grew more direct, possibly more political, possibly more personal, ranging into the territories that the mixed tables conventions put slightly out of reach. The footmen remaining in the room during this period heard a somewhat different kind of conversation, and the professional fiction of non-hearing was, if anything, even more important during these after-dinner moments. The port circulated, the cigars were lit. The fire in the dining room fireplace burned steadily, the room warm now with the accumulated heat of the candles and the people, and the evening's long activity. This was, in many ways, the high point of the Victorian household's day. The performance at its most complete, the evening's guests most fully gathered, the success of the dinner established and no longer in question, the conversational possibilities of the occasion being explored in their fullest extent. And then, gradually, the evening's energy began to dissipate. The ladies, in the drawing-room, had been joined by the gentlemen. The final coffee had been served. The last of the evening's music, if music there had been, had concluded. The late hour was making itself felt. The carriages were being called. The guests were departing. The footman at the front door stood in the cold night air, or, on wet evenings, under the portico, and handed guests into their carriages, closed the carriage door, watched the vehicle roll away down the drive. Each departure meant one fewer pair of hands to serve, one fewer presence in the evening's managed complexity, the drawing-room slowly emptying until only the family remained. And then they too retired, and the house began its transition from the dressed state of the evening to the undressed state of night. This transition was the butler's final domain. He moved through the public rooms with the assurance of long professional habit, checking that all was as it should be. The fire in the dining room damped down, the candles in the hallway extinguished, the wine glasses that remained in the drawing room collected for washing, the jewellery that had been left absent-mindedly on a side table retrieved and secured, the windows checked for their proper fastening, the front door locked and bolted, the bolts drawn home with a quiet satisfaction, the day's transaction with the outside world complete, the household closed and private and at rest. The domestic servants of Victorian England were not silent. They left records, not many, and not in the form we might expect, but real records nonetheless. Letters home to mothers and sisters, sometimes dictated or written with painstaking care by people whose schooling had been limited. Diaries kept in small, careful handwriting in cheap notebooks. Testimonials given in support of former colleagues, notes in the margins of housekeeping books, the occasional memoir written in later life by those who had risen to positions of some comfort and could look back on their service years with the complex mixture of nostalgia and rueful recognition that old work often produces. From these records, voices emerge. A kitchen maid in a London house in 1887 writes to her mother in Shropshire. She is well. She has been given a new uniform. The cook is not unkind, though strict. The other girls are friendly except for one who is standoffish. She finds the city strange. The noise, the smell, the endless procession of strangers in the streets when she has her afternoon off on Thursdays. She misses the quiet. She misses the smell of the fields. But the work is good, and the pay is regular, and she's sending home what she can. A footman in a Mayfair house in 1895 keeps a small diary. His entries are brief and factual. The dinners, the guests, the weather, the small events of each day noted in a handwriting that becomes more confident as the months pass. Occasionally there is something more personal, a visit to his brother who works in a factory in Lambeth and with whom he trades news of their family back in Norfolk. A Sunday afternoon spent walking in Hyde Park with two of the other footmen, the grass bright after rain, children sailing boats on the Serpentine. A Christmas Day entry. The family gave each member of staff a small present, and the cook prepared a special dinner for the servants' table, and there was singing in the hall after, and it was a good day. A housekeeper in a large country house in Worcestershire writes in her housekeeping book not only the inventories and accounts that were her professional duty, but occasional notes on the domestic arrangements that reveal, between the lines, a picture of her life and mind. The quantity of coal ordered for a cold February, the replacement of 3 damaged dinner plates, the arrival of a new housemaid from the village. She seems capable, the housekeeper notes, a little shy but willing. The note is brief and professional, but behind it you can sense a long accumulated experience of assessing new arrivals, of understanding what shyness and willingness might become in a few years' time with the right guidance. A lady's maid writes to a friend who has left service to marry. She finds she does not regret the life, though she misses the companionship. The work is familiar. The mistress is not always easy, but is fundamentally decent, and the position provides for her needs adequately. She has been offered a position in a grander house at higher wages, but she is hesitant. The new household would mean leaving the people she knows, the routines she has mastered, the small accumulated securities of a familiar place. She's not sure the money is worth it. These letters and diaries reveal lives of considerable inner complexity. The servants of Victorian England were not, as a certain kind of historical nostalgia sometimes suggests, either happy ciphers content with their place, or oppressed victims without agency or voice. They were people navigating a set of real constraints and real opportunities, making real choices within real limits, finding real satisfactions and real frustrations in the particular life that history had given them. Many servants left service as soon as they could. For women, the most common route out was marriage, and the conventions of the era usually required that a female servant leave her position upon marrying. For men, opportunities accumulated gradually over a career. A footman might aspire to a butler's position, a position of considerable status and comfort. Some servants used their years in domestic service to save money, acquiring capital that allowed them eventually to set up small businesses, a boarding house, a shop, a laundry of their own. Others stayed. Some stayed for decades, their lives becoming so thoroughly intertwined with a particular household that the distinction between my life and this household's life grew difficult to maintain. There are instances recorded of servants who had been with a family for 40 or 50 years, who had watched the children they first served grow up and have children of their own, who had become, in a sense, part of the family's story, even as they remained always, legally and socially, outside it. The question of loyalty was a complicated one. Employers who treated their servants fairly and with something approaching personal regard, who noticed illness, who gave fair wages and adequate time off, who remembered that their employees were human beings with their own needs and circumstances, tended to command a real and durable loyalty in return. The housekeeper who had served a family for 30 years was not there only for the wages. She was there because the house was, in some meaningful sense, hers too. Her knowledge, her standards, her daily care had made it what it was, and that investment created attachment. But loyalty was not blind. Servants left positions that were intolerable. They gave notice, sometimes very short notice, when the work became too hard, the treatment too unkind, the circumstances too difficult to bear. They talked among themselves, and word spread through the network of servants' registry offices and personal connections that certain houses were good positions and others were not. A household with a reputation for cruelty or excessive demand found difficulty attracting good servants and keeping them. The relationship between employer and employee in Victorian domestic service was, in this way, more dynamic than the formal hierarchy suggested. The family needed the servants, needed them desperately in fact, since the entire machinery of their daily lives depended on this labour. That need gave the servants a form of power, quiet and unacknowledged, and rarely exercised openly, but real. A good cook who threatened to leave was a serious matter. A trusted butler whose departure would disrupt the household's functioning for months represented a genuine vulnerability. and both parties understood this, even when the formal social vocabulary available to them had no words for it. The record of the Victorian servant's relationship to religion is, in many ways, the record of the Victorian period's own complex and varied religious life, refracted through the particular conditions of domestic service. Most servants came from backgrounds in which religious observance was a natural part of life, whether the established church, the various nonconformist traditions, or, in households with Irish members, Roman Catholicism. The great Victorian questions of faith and doubt, of geological time and biblical authority, of the place of conscience within institutional religion. These were questions that circulated through all levels of society, not just among the educated professional classes where they most visibly played out. A housemaid who attended the local Methodist chapel on her Sunday morning off was not only fulfilling a ritual obligation, she was participating in a community, a tradition of singing and fellowship and practical mutual support that provided something the household could not, a sense of belonging to a community of equals, a space where her social identity was not defined by her service to others. The chapel congregation knew her as herself, as Mary or Bessie or Annie, not as the between maid or the kitchen maid. Her opinions mattered there. Her voice was heard in the hymns singing with as much right as anyone else's. The connections she made in the chapel provided practical support, knowledge of other positions, assistance in times of illness or difficulty, the sociability of shared belief. In households where the family was of a different religious persuasion from their servants, which was not uncommon, a tactful management of the difference was required. A Catholic cook in a Protestant household attended her own church. A nonconformist housemaid in a high Anglican family's establishment might feel the disjunction between her employer's religious culture and her own. This was navigated mostly through the same conventions of discretion and professionalism that governed all the potential points of friction between the servant's private life and the family's expectations. The Victorian Sunday was, for servants, a half-relief at best. The morning service was the formal religious occasion for those who attended it, but the household still needed to function, breakfast still needed to be served, fires still needed burning. The rhythm of the week slowed but did not stop, and in the afternoon, in houses where the convention of servants' Sunday afternoon off was observed, there was a quality of release time that was different from the Thursday half-day. Sunday afternoons were quieter, less crowded with the world's entertainments, more likely to be spent in letter writing or private reading, or the particular kind of quiet sociability that the day's mood encouraged. The letters written on Sunday afternoons form some of the most revealing documents in the archive of servants' lives. Written with care, often with the awareness that the recipient might share them with the wider family, they show both what servants wished to communicate about their lives and what they understood to be of interest to those who knew them. They describe the house and the family with a circumspection that suggests a clear awareness of the line between appropriate sharing and professional indiscretion. They describe the other servants with the mixture of warmth and careful qualification that suggests real affection bounded by professional caution. They describe the small details of life, the weather, the state of the garden, a new dress, a visit from a fellow servant's sister, with a specificity that tells you that these details mattered, that the texture of daily life was worth recording. These letters were often kept. The mother who received letters from a daughter in service treasured them, not just for their news, but for the evidence they provided that the daughter was well, was safe, was still connected to the family despite the distance and the difference that service imposed. The practice of keeping these letters means that some of them have survived, and the survival of even a small number of them gives us voices that would otherwise be entirely silent. What those voices tell us consistently is that the servants of Victorian England were not passive objects of history, but active participants in it. People who made choices, formed relationships, held opinions, struggled with difficulties, and found satisfactions in ways that were constrained by their circumstances, but never entirely determined by them. The constraints were real, the servitude was real. But so was the humanity that persisted within and through, and sometimes in spite of those constraints. The memory of domestic service in Victorian England is a complicated one. Nostalgia for the era of candlelight and silver and the impeccably set dinner table, tends to obscure the human labour that produced those effects, to render invisible the 16 people who woke before the family and worked after the family slept, whose bodies bore the mark of that work, whose lives were given over to the maintenance of another household's comfort and beauty. But erasure runs the other way too. The reduction of Victorian servants to victims, to silenced and oppressed figures without agency or voice, is also a form of invisibility, a different kind of disappearing act that denies these individuals the full complexity of their actual lives. They were workers in a system that was often unfair and sometimes brutal, yes. They were also skilled professionals, social beings, people with rich inner lives and strong opinions and real relationships and private joys. Both things are true. The Victorian servant was constrained and capable, exploited and proud, limited and fully alive. To hold both of these truths simultaneously, without resolving the tension between them into something simpler and more comfortable, is to begin to see these lives as they actually were. Not every day was a dinner party. Not every week brought house guests. Between the great events that structured the Victorian household's social calendar, there stretched the ordinary texture of ordinary days. And it was in this texture, this repetition and rhythm, that the real substance of servants' lives was to be found. Monday was washing day in most Victorian households. The laundry was begun early in the morning with the heating of enormous quantities of water. Coppers fired up before dawn, steam rising from the laundry building by 7 o'clock. The laundry maid and any helpers she had would sort the household linen, sheets and pillowcases, towels and napkins, tablecloths, the family's personal clothing that required laundering. White cottons and linens were treated separately from coloured fabrics. Woolens were treated separately again, and each category had its own washing procedure, temperature and time. The physical labour of Victorian laundry was extraordinary. The sheets of a large household numbered in the dozens, each one wrung by hand in a process that required considerable strength, put through the mangle to press out additional water, then either hung outside to dry in good weather or draped across wooden drying racks in the laundry room when the weather did not permit. Everything was starched that needed to be starched. The tablecloths and napkins, the shirt fronts and collars and cuffs, the housemaids' caps and aprons. Starching was its own skilled process, the concentration of the starch solution adjusted for different fabrics. The ironing that followed requiring a heat and pressure, judged entirely by the feel of the iron on the fabric and the response of the fabric to that heat. Tuesday was a more varied day. Rooms that had been given a quick clean on Monday received their more thorough weekly attention on Tuesday. The drawing-room carpet was beaten, rolled back, carried out, hung on the line in the yard, struck repeatedly with a carpet beater, until the dust ceased to rise from it, then brought back in and relaid. The furniture in the drawing-room was moved out for this process, replaced carefully in its exact positions, the positions known by memory and by the faint marks left on the polished boards beneath. Wednesday brought the silver cleaning. The butler and the footmen worked through the household silver in the butler's pantry, a room that smelled of Goddard's plate powder and old leather, and the sharp, bright scent of clean metal. The silver represented a considerable financial investment for the family, the accumulated result of generations of acquisitions, wedding gifts, inherited pieces, newly purchased additions to the collection, and its maintenance was a matter of both practical and symbolic significance. Tarnished silver at a dinner table was a humiliation. Brilliant silver was a statement. Each piece was cleaned methodically. The powder was applied with a soft cloth, worked into the surface in small circular motions, then left to dry to a pale, chalky film before being buffed away with clean leather. Engraved pieces required special attention, a small brush to work the paste into the deepest lines of the design, then a very fine cloth to polish within the engraving without leaving residue. It was work that required patience and care, but it produced results. The satisfaction of holding a candelabra up to the light and seeing it return a perfect, brilliant reflection was real, and the footmen who performed this task regularly had a quiet pride in their ability to achieve it. Thursday was the day when many households gave the lower servants their half-day off, the Thursday afternoon that belonged, by convention, to the staff's own use. This was the precious breathing space in a week of continuous labour, and what servants did with it reflected the full range of their individual characters and circumstances. Some visited family, some attended lectures or concerts or the improving entertainments that Victorian culture provided for the working classes. Some simply walked. The parks of London in particular became spaces where servants from across the city converged on their afternoons off, relieved, anonymous, free for a few hours from the requirement to be anyone's servant. The letters and diaries of servants describe these Thursday afternoons with a specificity of pleasure that speaks to how much they were valued. A walk to a tea room, a visit to a picture gallery. An afternoon spent at a friend's lodgings, talking freely about things it was not possible to say at work. The experience of being in public, in a city, among people going about their own lives without any reference to you or need of you. This apparently simple freedom was significant enough to be recorded and remembered. Friday and Saturday carried the house toward the weekend, which in many establishments was the most socially intense period of the week. Guests arriving for the weekend, additional cooking and service required, the standards of presentation heightened. The week's accumulated cleaning, polishing, pressing, and preparation came together in the quality of the house as it received its visitors on Friday evening. Sunday was, in theory, a day of rest, and to some degree in practice as well. The family attended church, and many servants did too, either the same church or a different one according to their denomination and the household's customs. Some households gave servants Sunday afternoon as additional free time after the midday meal, but the house still needed to be maintained, fires still needed to be laid, meals still needed to be served. Sunday was never entirely free for anyone. The rhythm of the week only slightly slackened rather than stopped. Through all these days, through all these weeks and months and years, the physical reality of the work impressed itself on the servants' bodies. The hands of a laundry maid or a kitchen maid were never entirely smooth. The constant exposure to water and alkalis and heat roughened and reddened them permanently, and this physical mark of their work followed them everywhere, into the streets and the parks and the church pews, making them legible as workers in a way that no amount of careful Sunday dress could entirely conceal. The housemaid's knees worn by daily kneeling at fire grates, the cook's forearms lined with small burn marks from years of close work at a hot range, the butler's back stiffened by years of carrying heavy trays, the footman's legs tired from the constant stairs. The body kept its account of the work done, and the work was considerable. And yet these bodies were also capable of something beyond the work, capable of dancing, on the rare occasions when a staff party or an outdoor celebration provided the excuse, capable of walking miles on a Thursday afternoon without apparent fatigue, capable of the physical pleasure of a well-made bed or a perfectly polished surface. The body that worked could also rest and rest well, and in the servants' rooms at the end of a long day, the sleep that came was the deep, honest sleep of genuine physical exhaustion. Not the restless half-sleep of anxiety or the shallow doze of idleness, but something complete and restorative. The laundry at the end of a large Victorian house was a building unto itself, a domestic outbuilding that housed operations too noisy and steam-filled and space-demanding to be conducted within the main structure. On washing day, the approach to the laundry building was visible from across the grounds, the steam rising from the copper chimney, the windows running with condensation on cold mornings, the rhythmic sound of the mangle at work carrying out into the garden. The washing routine followed a strict order of precedence that was both hygienic and social. The family's personal linen was washed separately from the household linen, which was washed separately from the servants' personal clothes. The whites were washed before the colours. The quality fabrics were handled separately from the everyday. This ordering was not arbitrary. It prevented dye transfer, prevented the contamination of fine fabrics by rougher cleaning methods, and maintained the visual hierarchy that the household social structure required. The copper, the large fixed vessel in which the greatest quantities of linen were boiled, was the laundry's heart. It was fired in the small hours on washing day, the water heated before the laundry maid had time for anything else, because without the hot water nothing could proceed. When the copper was at temperature, the white linens went in. The sheets, the tablecloths, the napkins, the shirt fronts, all of them to be boiled with washing soda until they were thoroughly clean, then removed with the wooden copper stick, a long-handled implement like a short oar, and transferred to the rinsing tubs. The rinsing was done in cold water, several changes of it, until the water ran clear and the linen smelled clean rather than soapy. Then the wringing, hand-wringing for smaller pieces, the mangle for larger ones. The mangle was a substantial piece of equipment. 2 heavy rollers set one above the other in a wooden frame, turned by a large handle on the side. The The linen fed between them and the water expressed by the weight of the rollers. It made a satisfying mechanical sound as it turned, the creak and rumble of the wooden frame, the wet slap of the emerging linen, and the effect was to produce sheets and tablecloths that were already half dry, and very much flatter than hand-wringing alone could achieve. The ironing that followed was done with irons heated on the range. Solid metal irons of several weights, lifted from the range with an insulated handle, their temperature tested by holding them near the face and feeling the heat, or by the old test of spitting on the surface, a domestic science that produced a reliable sizzle if the iron was at the right temperature, a silence if it was too cool, and a small crisis if it was too hot, and the spit vaporized instantly. The laundry-maid knew her irons as the cook knew her pots, knew which was best for which purpose, which retained its heat longest, when to return it to the range for reheating before it lost sufficient temperature to be effective. The ironing of a household's full complement of linen was hours of sustained physical work, moving back and forth down the long ironing table, the iron lifting and pressing and moving in the smooth strokes that produced the crisp, flat result. The starched items required particular care. The starch was made fresh, a mixture of starch powder dissolved in cold water, and then stirred into hot, producing a clear, slightly thick liquid that was applied to the fabric while it was still damp, then allowed to dry to a slight stiffness before ironing. The ironing of starched linen was a different physical experience from ironing unstarched. The fabric more resistant, the steam rising as the hot iron made contact with the moisture in the starch. The result a surface of almost cardboard stiffness that would hold its crisp form through a dinner or a day's wear. The shirt fronts and collars and cuffs that the gentlemen of the family required were among the most demanding items in the laundry. The starch had to be applied very precisely. The rest of the shirt remained relatively flexible, only the front bib and the collar and cuffs achieving their full rigidity. The ironing of the starched front was a delicate operation, involving a rounded iron of specific shape that curved to follow the convex form of the shirt front, pressing the starch to its maximum smoothness without leaving any line or ripple. A poorly starched or poorly ironed shirt front was immediately visible at dinner, and the embarrassment that it caused the gentleman who wore it was real. The Victorian dress code's requirement for impeccable linen made visible any failure in its production. The linen press was another piece of laundry equipment with a satisfying mechanical presence, a large wooden screw press that could apply considerable force to folded linen, creating the sharp, precise creases that distinguished properly stored Victorian linen from improperly stored. Tablecloths, after ironing, were folded according to a specific pattern, in quarters, then in eighths, with the central fold on the upper surface and the outer folds hidden below, and stacked in the linen press under weight until called into use. The linen closet, maintained by the housekeeper, was a room of quiet, orderly beauty in the best Victorian households. The shelves bore their stacked linens in precise columns, each category clearly separated, the whole maintaining the kind of visual order that was its own form of professional pride. The smell of this room, clean linen, lavender sachets placed among the stacks to discourage insects and impart a subtle fragrance, was one of the most pleasant in the house, and the housekeeper who entered it for her weekly inventory counted the satisfaction of that orderly abundance among the quiet rewards of her work. The sewing room was adjacent to or associated with the linen closet in many houses, a room where the household sewing was done, the mending and making of household linen and sometimes of the family's clothes, by the housekeeper or by a seamstress employed for the purpose. The sewing machine, by the 1870s and 1880s, had become a standard piece of household equipment in establishments of any size, its mechanical production of even stitches at high speed transforming the time required for household sewing from the potentially endless occupation it had been in the hand-sewing era into something that could be scheduled and completed in rational time. The household silver, clean and brilliant from its weekly cleaning, was stored in the butler's safe between meals. This safe was a heavy lockable piece of furniture fitted to the wall of the butler's pantry, its interior shelved and lined with a material that protected the silver from tarnishing. The butler held its key, and the responsibility for the silver's security was entirely his. Victorian silver was valuable. The household silver of a substantial family represented an investment of thousands of pounds, and its secure storage was not a matter of bureaucratic compliance, but of genuine financial protection. The inventory of the silver, maintained in the butler's book, listed every piece by its description and weight. New additions to the collection were recorded, pieces sent for repair or restoration were noted, and their return confirmed. If a piece went missing, as occasionally happened through breakage, loss or theft, the discovery and the consequent investigation were among the more stressful events in the below-stairs calendar. The butler bore the primary responsibility for explaining an unaccounted-for absence, and the process of accounting for it, whether through honest explanation of an accident or the more difficult investigation of apparent theft, tested all his professional resources. Theft was not unknown in Victorian domestic service, though it was less common than the anxieties of employers sometimes suggested. A servant who stole was taking an enormous risk, not just of immediate dismissal, but of the legal consequences that the Victorian legal system was prepared to apply with considerable severity to property crimes, and of the permanent destruction of the professional reputation on which their livelihood depended. The majority of servants did not steal, but the minority who did represented a real presence in the social history of the period, and the measures taken to prevent theft, the locked silver safe, the locked wine cellar, the locked store cupboard, the inventory systems maintained by the housekeeper and the butler, were responses to a real, if limited, risk. The relationship between trust and control in the Victorian household was always in negotiation. The employer trusted the servants sufficiently to give them access to everything in the house, to the silver, to the wine, to the family's clothing and personal possessions, to the intimate spaces of the bedrooms and dressing rooms. But that trust was bounded by systems of control that acknowledged its limits. The locks, the inventories, the inspection of servants' boxes before departure, the provision in employment law that allowed an employer to open a servant's luggage on reasonable grounds of suspicion. These controls were rarely invoked in most households most of the time. The daily life of the Victorian house ran on trust, on the mutual understanding between employer and servant that each would honour their side of a relationship that benefited both. But the controls were there, always there, a reminder that the trust was conditional and contingent. The great Victorian house existed in a wider world, and the servants who lived in it were not, despite the immersive quality of their daily lives, cut off from that world entirely. They were part of it, shaped by it, participating in it, bringing it into the house with them on their Thursday afternoons and their monthly days off, and through the constant informal flow of below-stairs conversation. The Victorian era was a period of immense and sometimes dizzying change. In the decades between the 1840s and the end of the century, the country transformed itself. Railways spread across the landscape, connecting places that had been effectively isolated from one another for centuries. Towns grew into cities, cities spread into conurbations, new industries rose and old ones declined. The British Empire reached its greatest extent, drawing goods and people from every continent into the country's economic orbit. The servants in a great house experienced all of this in refracted and indirect ways. The railway that had once been a technological marvel was, by the 1880s, simply the way people travelled, and servants travelled by it too on their journeys home and back, sitting in third class with their carefully packed boxes, watching the countryside open and close through the steam-streaked windows. The goods that arrived in the kitchen, the Indian tea, the Caribbean sugar, the American dried fruits, the imported French wines, were evidence of global networks invisible from the kitchen but present in everything they touched and prepared and served. The political world touched servants in particular ways. The great questions of the Victorian age, the expansion of the franchise, the rights of labour, the conditions of the poor, the place of women in public life, were not abstract matters to people who had grown up in working-class communities and who maintained connections to those communities through family and correspondence and the common knowledge of their class. A footman whose brother worked in a factory was closer to the labour movement than the family he served. A parlour maid whose father had been a Chartist activist in her childhood brought that political inheritance into the room with her, even if it never found expression there. The question of women's lives was particularly acute. Female domestic servants formed the largest single occupational group of women in Victorian England, and the conditions of their working lives, the long hours, the restrictions on personal freedom, the requirement to remain unmarried in many positions, the vulnerability to dismissal without reference, were part of the broader conversation about women's status and rights that the era was conducting. Women's suffrage campaigners of the late Victorian period were aware of the irony that the domestic servants who maintained the households of progressive families were among the least socially protected workers in the country. For younger servants, particularly those in urban households with access to the expanding cultural life of Victorian cities, the wider world exerted a particular pull. The music halls that proliferated through London and the major cities offered entertainment affordable to working-class wages. Comedy, songs, acrobatics, melodrama, all of it performed before audiences that included servants on their evenings off. The penny press, the illustrated papers, the cheap novels that circulated through lending libraries and second-hand bookshops, all of these fed imaginations that were, within the working day, required to be focused entirely on the tasks of service. There is something poignant about the image of a housemaid reading a penny romance in the 15 minutes before she fell asleep, reading about lives more dramatic, more free, more full of personal choice than the one she was living, finding in the page the adventure and the emotion that her daily existence could not provide. But there is also something affirming about it. She was reading, she was imagining. She was the full possessor of an interior life that her work neither acknowledged nor diminished. The great houses themselves were beginning to change by the late Victorian period, pressures building that would accelerate in the new century. The middle classes were expanding, and their households could not always afford the full complement of staff that the older model required. The single-servant household, one woman to do everything, became increasingly common in the terrace houses of the suburbs, and the conditions of that single servant, worked from morning to night with no colleagues, no hierarchy, no community of shared labour, were often far worse than those of her equivalents in the larger establishments. The technology of the house was changing too. Running water, piped gas, later electricity, these transformations altered the work of housekeeping profoundly and gradually. The heavy labour of carrying coal and water, the delicate skill of lamp and candle maintenance, the exact science of managing a range, these were being superseded by technologies that required less physical strength, but different kinds of knowledge and attention. A cook working with a gas range in 1900 was doing something fundamentally different in its material experience from her equivalent with a coal range in 1870. And the social world around the servants was shifting too. The trades union movement, gathering strength through the latter decades of the century, had almost no foothold in domestic service. The isolation of servants, employed one or a few to a household, without the collective solidarity that factory workers could develop, made organisation extraordinarily difficult. But the conversations happening in the wider world about fair wages and reasonable hours and the dignity of labour reached even the most isolated servants through the newspapers and the talk of the halls. The great Victorian house, for all its apparent permanence, all those tons of stone and timber, all those traditions of service and deference, was not permanent. The century was approaching its end, and with it, the world that had produced it. The servants who lived and worked in it in the 1890s were doing so in a world that was already becoming the past, though few of them could have known it. But tonight, the house is still. The century still has years to run. The fires are banked and the silver is clean and the families are asleep and the servants are asleep. Outside, the night wind moves through the copper beech at the end of the drive, and the leaves that remain on its branches, a few still after the autumn's steady taking, move in the darkness with a soft, papery sound. The house breathes. The night holds it. The stars are out over the gardens, clear and cold, the same stars that have always been there and will always be there, indifferent and beautiful above all our small and earnest lives. As the Victorian period moved toward its close, the world that had produced and sustained the great tradition of domestic service was beginning, imperceptibly at first, to change in ways that would eventually transform it beyond recognition. The social changes that would, in the 20th century, substantially reduce the pool of people willing to enter domestic service were already gathering in the 1890s. The expansion of elementary education under the 1870 Education Act had produced a generation of girls who were literate and numerate and whose expectations, however modestly, exceeded those of their parents' generation. The growth of alternative forms of employment, in the shops, in the new department stores, in the factories and workshops of the industrial cities, offered young women the possibility of work that did not require them to live in another person's house, to subordinate their social identity to the requirements of their employer, to limit their freedom to a half-day's leave each week. The shop girl of the 1890s, behind her counter in one of the new department stores, her dress regulated by the store's uniform requirements, but her time her own when the working day was done, was, in many respects, in a more constrained working environment than a domestic servant. The hours were long, the pay was low, the supervision could be as arbitrary and as demanding as any housekeeper's authority. But she went home at night. She lived her own domestic life in a room of her own choosing. She was not on call through the evening hours, not required to be available at any moment a bell rang. The shop girl's freedom was minimal and often illusory, but it felt like freedom compared to the all-encompassing enclosure of domestic service. This perception, that service was a kind of unfreedom, a surrender of self that other forms of work did not require, was becoming more widespread in the working-class communities from which domestic servants were drawn. The vocabulary of the labour movement, spreading through the 1880s and 1890s, gave new names to the experiences that servants had always had but had not always been able to articulate clearly. The idea of a working day with defined beginning and end, the idea of a private life that belonged to the worker rather than the employer, the idea of a collective identity as a worker rather than an individual identity as a servant. These ideas were in the air, and they reached even into the servants' halls. For the families who employed servants, the domestic labour question was becoming an increasingly conscious preoccupation. The servant problem, the difficulty of finding and retaining good domestic staff, was a topic of social conversation and of domestic management literature through the 1880s and 1890s. Housekeeping manuals of the period addressed the challenge of staff management with increasing urgency, advising employers on how to create conditions that would attract and keep reliable servants. The advice was telling in its very existence. The fact that it needed to be written suggested that the old certainties of the employer-servant relationship were no longer quite so certain. The physical space of the great house was itself beginning to reflect these pressures. Architects designing new country houses or refurbishing old ones were being asked to consider the accommodation of servants more carefully than had previously been usual. Better lit bedrooms, more adequate washing facilities, heating in the attic rooms that had previously been cold without remedy. These improvements were practical responses to the recognition that servants who were decently housed stayed longer and worked better. They were also, to some degree, moral responses to a growing social awareness that the conditions in which servants lived were not always defensible. The introduction of labour-saving technologies accelerated through the period. Hot water systems, which distributed heated water through pipes to the upper floors and saved the housemaids the carrying of heavy cans, became standard in new construction. Gas cooking ranges, cleaner and more controllable than coal, were being installed in progressive London households by the 1880s. Vacuum cleaners, in their earliest and most cumbersome forms, appeared in the very last years of the century, their promise of reduced labour only partly delivered by machines that were large, heavy, and mechanically unreliable. These technologies did not immediately reduce the number of servants required. In the short term, they often simply redirected the same labour into different tasks. But they were the first signs of a longer transformation, the gradual substitution of mechanical and later electrical systems for human labour, that would, over the following century, fundamentally alter the relationship between households and the people who served them. The census figures tell their own story. In 1891, domestic servants formed the largest single occupational group in England and Wales. By 1911, the numbers were already in relative decline, the proportion of the working population in domestic service decreasing even as the absolute numbers remained large. By the 1930s, the great Victorian household with its full complement of specialist staff had become a rarity. By the 1960s, it was effectively extinct as a social form, but in the 1890s all of this lay in the future. The present was the house, its 16 people in their appointed places, the work continuing as it had always continued, the fires burning, the silver polished, the beds made with the precision of long training and long habit, the meals prepared and served and cleared, and the dishes washed and the kitchen set in order for tomorrow. The world was changing. It had always been changing. And the house stood in the middle of that change, solid and warm and full of people going about their days, carrying coal and ironing linens and setting the table for dinner, as if the particular form of life they had been given was simply the natural order of things, as if it had always been so, as if it would always be so. As if the copper beech at the end of the drive had always been there, and would always be there, and the wind through its branches had always made that particular sound, and would always make it, and the house under the stars had always been this house, and would always be, and the night that held them all was the same night that had always held houses and people, and the quiet, persistent particularity of human life. It was not so, of course. Nothing is permanent. But there is something in the middle of an ordinary day, in the warmth of a fire laid and burning, in the clean smell of ironed linen, in the weight of a well-polished silver spoon, that feels like it might be. The century was drawing toward its close. The servants were doing their work, and the house, as houses do, was simply being itself, containing all of this, witnessing all of this, and enduring. The night has no edge you can find. It simply deepens, as nights always have deepened, and the house in it is a shape against the darker shapes of trees, its windows dark now on the upper floors, the last lamp in the basement passage burning with a steady, untroubled flame. Let us stay here for a while in this particular place, at the edge of things. Let us not move quite yet into the day, but remain in this threshold space, the space before morning, after night, when the hours are their own kind of quiet, and the world is at its most completely itself. The great houses of Victorian England were, in a sense, machines. Large, complex, human-powered machines that consumed labour and produced comfort, that transformed raw material into the particular texture of privileged daily life. The coal became warmth, the flour became bread, the muscle and attention of 16 individuals became the invisible condition of possibility within which a family lived. But they were also something else, something less easily defined. They were places with character and atmosphere and memory, places that shaped the people who lived and worked in them and were shaped in return. The young girl who came to a house at 14 and left it at 24 had spent 10 years of her forming life within those walls. She had learned there and worked there and made her most important friendships there. She had been unhappy there sometimes and happy there sometimes, had been proud of her work and ashamed of her failures. She had grown into herself there in the particular way that people grow into themselves in the specific places where their lives are happening. When she left, she carried the house with her, not as a weight exactly, but as a formation. The way she moved through a room, the way she thought about the relationship between cleanliness and order, the way she listened for what was needed without waiting to be asked. These formations were real and lasting. The domestic servant who had worked for 20 years in large Victorian households was a different kind of person, in certain ways, from one who had not better or worse, but differently shaped, carrying a different set of embodied knowledges and professional habits and social understandings. This shaping was not always acknowledged, and certainly not always valued by the world outside service. But it was real. The house shaped the servant, and the servant, through the daily and nightly work of maintenance and preparation and attendance, shaped the house. Not in any way that history records. There are no monuments to the housemaids who polished the floors, no plaques to commemorate the cooks who fed the families, but in the material reality of the thing itself. The floors are smooth because they were polished. The silver is brilliant because it was cleaned. The linen is white because it was washed. The bread was made, the fire was laid, the table was set. The house exists in the form it exists in because of the work of hands that history has largely forgotten. Let us consider the morning in more detail, that narrow passage of time between the dark and the day, when the house was most completely itself, when the family slept and the servants moved through it like a different kind of occupancy. The under-housemaid who crept down the back stairs at 5:30 carried a candlestick in one hand and her cleaning supplies in the other, brushes, dustpan, a twist of paper for firelighting. The back stairs were steep and narrow, uncarpeted, designed for utility rather than aesthetics. They smelled of the house's working life, stone and wood and the faint cold exhalation of an unheated space. Every house had two circulation systems, the front, which was for the family, and the back, which was for everyone else. The back stairs were older, darker, more practical. They connected every level of the house to every other level without crossing the public spaces through which the family moved. In the mornings, the back stairs were all she knew of the house for the first hour. Down them, then through the servants' corridor, then to the kitchen passage, then across to wherever the morning's first fire was to be laid. She might pass the hall boy coming up from the coal cellar with the first heavy scuttle, nod to him in the wordless acknowledgement of people sharing a pre-dawn quiet, continue on her way. The drawing room at 5:30 in the morning was a different room from the drawing room in the evening. Its furniture stood in dim solidity, the white dust sheets that covered the most delicate pieces making ghostly shapes in the grey light. The fireplace was cold and grey with yesterday's ashes. The flowers on the centre table, not yet changed, not yet wilted, were still in their arrangement of yesterday's reception, their fragrance still present but quieting toward the sweet, slightly melancholy smell that cut flowers carry as they begin their long departure from the living world. She worked in this room without disturbing it more than was necessary for the work, removed the dust sheets and folded them, carried them to the linen closet, returned, laid the fire, working in the half-dark with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this same thing 300 times and knew the grate's particular dimensions by touch. Paper, kindling, coal, small pieces first, the match. The small, satisfying moment when the paper caught and the fire was committed to its own existence, burning with an energy that would require no further assistance for a while. She moved to the next room, and the next. The pattern repeated in its variations, different grates, different arrangements of furniture, different qualities of morning light entering through the different orientations of the windows. The library faced north and was always darker in the morning. The morning room faced east and caught the first daylight with a peculiar early brilliance that was already fading by the time the fire was properly going and the room was ready for use. In the kitchen, something was always happening. The kitchen never had the empty, waiting quality of the reception rooms in the early morning. It was a working space, inhabited and active from before dawn, and it showed this in the accumulated presence of the previous day's work and the beginning evidence of the current day's. The range was already warm from its overnight banking. The first thing each morning was to build it back to its working temperature, opening the dampers and the flues, adding fresh coal to the carefully maintained overnight fire, watching the temperature gauge, if the range had one, or simply reading the heat with the palm of a hand held near the surface. The cook arrived to her kitchen as to a theatre of which she was the director. She assessed the state of the range, the state of the stock on the back of the stove, the contents of the cold larder and the scullery as the morning's first act of professional evaluation. She planned. In her head, she carried the day's menu, what had been agreed with the mistress the previous day, what the kitchen garden had sent in, what was available in the larder. She organised the day's work into its sequence. What needed to begin first, what could be prepared in parallel, what would require her own close attention, and what could be safely delegated to the kitchen maid. This daily planning was not written down in any formal way for most cooks. It lived in memory, in the professional consciousness that knew the time requirements of every dish, the way preparations built on one another, the critical path through the day's work that, if followed correctly, produced a dinner that was ready when it needed to be ready. A cook who lost this inner clarity, through illness, through distraction, through an unexpected demand that disrupted the schedule, felt it in the cooking, and the cooking showed it. The kitchen maid's education in this planning was an important part of her training. By observing the cook's daily organisation of the work, by performing the tasks that the cook allocated to her, and understanding why those tasks were ordered as they were, she was learning not just technique but strategy, the higher-order skill of managing complexity through time. A kitchen maid who had served an intelligent and communicative cook for 5 years left that position with a working knowledge of culinary management that was as valuable as any specific skill. The scullery maid's education was simpler and less varied, but not less real. She learned the properties of cleaning agents, what soda crystals did to different materials, what salt could do to a stain, the difference between the care required for iron pots and copper ones. She learned the physics of washing, hot water for grease, cold water for blood, the way soap saponified fat and allowed it to be rinsed away, the importance of rinsing thoroughly rather than leaving a soapy film that would cloud the next use. These were not lessons she was taught in any formal sense. They were observations she made repeatedly in the course of the work itself, and they accumulated into a practical chemistry of the everyday that would serve her throughout her life. The gardener, in his kitchen garden at the same early hour, was carrying out his own version of this same expertise in practice. He knew his soil, its particular texture and drainage and pH. which parts of the garden were warmest in early spring and which retained frost longest, which beds were most fertile and which needed amendment. He knew his plants with the particularity of someone who had watched them through hundreds of seasons, knew which varieties were most reliable, which were prone to particular pests or diseases, when to harvest for the best quality, how to store each crop through the winter. This knowledge was as deep and as skilled as any professional knowledge, and it was held in the same way, in the body, in the hands, in the long accumulative experience of paying close attention to the same things over many years. The kitchen garden itself was a space of considerable beauty, though it was not designed for beauty in the way that the formal garden was. Its beauty was the beauty of order and productivity, the straight drills of brassicas, the trained fruit trees against the south-facing wall, the neat beds of herbs with their different textures and the complex fragrance they produced when the dew on them was disturbed by a passing hand, the cucumber frames with their glass panes catching the morning light, the rows of sweet peas trained up their sticks and flowering with a profligacy that seemed almost impractical for a working garden. The kitchen garden wall was a microclimate in itself, the south-facing brick warming in the afternoon sun and radiating that warmth through the night, advancing the season for the tender crops trained against it, producing peaches and apricots and pears in quantities that the open garden could not have managed. The gardener managed this microclimate with the same precision he brought to everything else, adjusting the training of the branches, managing the water supply, pruning to the shape that maximised the wall's benefit. And the cut flower garden, adjacent to the kitchen garden, supplied the vases and the table arrangements that were changed each day in the house. The flower room maid, or the gardener's boy, in establishments where no specific flower room staff existed, cut the flowers in the early morning, when the blooms were at their most fully hydrated, and the heat of the day had not yet begun to draw moisture from them. They were carried to the flower room, a cool, light space fitted with shelves and buckets, and the tools of flower arranging, and there assembled into the arrangements that the housekeeper or the mistress had specified. Victorian flower arrangement followed principles of its own, not the spare minimalism of later 20th century aesthetics, but an abundance of mixed forms and colours that was deliberate in its generosity, the arrangement working outward from a central dominant bloom through progressively smaller flowers to a skirt of foliage at the rim of the vase. Seasonal constraints produced seasonal arrangements. The spring arrangements were pale and tentative, full of tulips and narcissi. Summer was exuberant, overflowing with roses and sweet peas and the endless abundance of the summer garden. Autumn brought the copper and russet and deep orange of chrysanthemums and dahlias. Winter relied on the greenhouse for its colour and the garden's evergreens for its structure. The arrangement, completed and placed on the hall table or the drawing-room mantelpiece or the centre of the dining table, made the garden visible within the house. It was a connection between the outdoor world of growth and the indoor world of comfort, a reminder that the house was not hermetically sealed against the natural world but continuously fed by it, depending on it for the colour and fragrance that made its interiors something more than merely functional. A Victorian housemaid's cleaning routine was as close to a performance art as any unacknowledged domestic task could be, and it was taken with a seriousness that reflected how central physical order was to the Victorian conception of a well-run life. The dusting began at the highest points and worked downward. This was not merely a practical method, but a kind of respect for the order of things, acknowledging that dust fell rather than rose, that the natural tendency of small particles was to descend, and that any cleaning system that worked against this tendency was creating unnecessary work. The mantelpiece first, then the chimney piece, then the picture frames, lifted slightly to dust behind them, then the shelves, then the furniture surfaces, then the floor. The fireplace itself required specific implements and specific care. The steel grate, in houses that had steel fittings, was polished with emery paper to a bright finish that reflected light and resisted rust. The iron components were treated with a preparation of graphite and oil that produced a deep, non-reflective black, very different from the steel's brightness, but equally intentional. The tiled hearth was scrubbed. The fender, the low metal barrier that prevented coals from rolling out onto the hearthrug, was polished with the specific polish appropriate to its material. The fireside tools, shovel, poker, tongs, bellows, were wiped and ordered. This attention to the fireplace was not mere fastidiousness. It was a recognition that the fire and its surround were the visual and literal centre of the room, the point to which eyes naturally turned, the source of the room's warmth and much of its light on winter evenings, the object that visitors noticed because they naturally oriented themselves toward it. A dull grate, a grimy fender, a hearth rug carrying the evidence of last night's careless stoking. These were visible signs of a household's standards, or lack of them. The carpet sweeper, by the 1880s and 1890s, had become a standard piece of domestic equipment in better furnished houses, a push-along device with rotating brushes that swept the surface dirt into a collection box without raising the kind of dust cloud that a hard brush produced. The carpet sweeper was a significant improvement on the earlier practice of sprinkling damp tea leaves on carpets before sweeping them, the dampness binding the dust and preventing it from rising. But it was not a substitute for the deeper cleaning that carpets required periodically. The deep cleaning of carpets, the beating and brushing, was one of the seasonal upheavals of the Victorian household. Twice a year, usually in spring and autumn, the housemaids undertook the task of rolling up the carpets, carrying them outdoors, draping them over the line or the fence, and beating them with long-handled carpet beaters, rattan frames of various shapes that were swung with a satisfying thwack against the fabric, and produced a dramatic release of the accumulated dust of months. This was hard, dirty work, but it produced results. The carpets, relaid after beating and brushing, looked and smelled demonstrably better, and the rooms seemed lighter and cleaner and fresher in consequence. The windows were cleaned on a regular schedule, inside and out. The cleaning of windows in a large Victorian house was a considerable undertaking. The high sash windows of the principal rooms had large glass areas that were cleaned with a preparation of water and vinegar, or, in some establishments, a proprietary preparation, then polished with a chamois leather or a piece of newspaper until they were entirely clear. A streaked or dusty window was another visible failure, particularly on a bright day, when the light revealed every smear and every trace of the cleaning process itself. The floors of the secondary rooms, the passages and the stairs and the servants' areas, were of stone or bare wood and were scrubbed on a regular schedule. Stone floors were scrubbed with a hard brush and hot soda water, then rinsed and allowed to dry. The result was a surface clean enough to reflect light when it caught the sun from a window or a lamp. Wood floors were scrubbed similarly, then dried and sometimes polished with a preparation of beeswax that, applied with a pad and buffed with a weighted brush, produced a surface of deep, quiet warmth. The polishing of wooden floors was physical work of a sustained and rhythmic kind. The heavy polishing brush pushed back and forth in long strokes, the beeswax worked into the grain by heat and friction, the result visible in the transformation of the surface from dull to luminous. There was satisfaction in this work, as there was satisfaction in all the cleaning tasks when they were done properly. The satisfaction of a surface restored to its intended state, of order imposed on disorder, of the day's small acts of maintenance accumulated into a house that was demonstrably better for the work. The housekeeper's inspection was the formal moment at which this satisfaction was either confirmed or complicated. She moved through the rooms after the morning cleaning was complete, carrying her small notebook, observing the results of the morning's work with an eye trained by long experience to notice whatever should not be there. A dust left on the back of a chair, a smear on a mirror, a fire that had been laid without sufficient care. The inspection was not punitive in the best households. It was corrective, its purpose being to maintain standards rather than to find fault. But the housemaid who heard her name called by the housekeeper after an inspection was conscious of a quickening of anxiety, whatever the actual content of what was to be said. This was the nature of professional correction. Its potential content shaped the emotional reception of its approach, regardless of what that content turned out to be. The housekeeper understood this, and in most cases communicated her corrections with a directness that was efficiently brief. This was not properly done. Here is how it should be, without extending the discomfort beyond the minimum necessary for the correction to be received and understood. The housemaid who was never corrected was either performing with unusual consistent perfection, or was working for a housekeeper who was not paying attention. In practice, the correction of small errors was part of the normal professional relationship between them, and the housemaid who could receive correction without disproportionate distress, who could hear the specific criticism, understand it and adjust, was the one who improved and eventually became the head housemaid, and in time, perhaps the housekeeper herself. The aspiration to rise within the servant hierarchy was real for those who had the capacity and the ambition for it. The path from under housemaid to head housemaid to housekeeper took years and required consistent performance. But it was a path that existed and that some women successfully travelled. The housekeeper who had begun as a between maid at 14 and reached her position of authority at 40 had a story of professional achievement that was, in its own terms, as genuine as any other professional advancement, the accumulation of skill and experience and judgment that the work had required and that she had provided. The world that Victorian servants inhabited in the evenings, after the dinner service was complete, after the family had retired to the drawing room, after the final clearing was done, had its own particular quality that was different from the working world of the daytime hours. The servants' hall in the evening was lit by oil lamp or gas, depending on the establishment, and the quality of that light, warmer than daylight, more orange, producing defined pools of illumination surrounded by comfortable shadow, created an atmosphere that was both cosy and slightly dramatic. Faces across the table were illuminated from below and the side, features softened by the warm light, the sense of enclosure and intimacy intensified by the contrast between the bright centre of the table and the darker corners of the room. The evening newspapers that made their way below stairs, sometimes a day old, passed down from the family's reading room, sometimes current if the butler had managed to acquire a copy, were read with genuine interest. The servants of Victorian England were engaged with the public world of their time, the political events, the foreign news, the sporting results, the court reports, the disaster stories that filled the penny papers. The footman who had spent the day in the training silence of professional service allowed himself in the evening to have opinions about the new Home Secretary's latest proposal, about the prospects for the England cricket team, about the extraordinary affair reported in the papers from somewhere in Africa or India, or one of the other distant territories that the Empire made simultaneously remote and vivid. The women's newspapers and magazines, by the 1880s, there was a growing periodical press aimed specifically at women, including working women, circulated through the servants' hall with their own kind of interest. The household advice columns, the fashion plates, observed with professional interest by the lady's maid, with more personal interest by the younger housemaids. The serialised fiction, the correspondence pages in which women wrote about their difficulties and received the editor's response. All of this was read and discussed and held up against the immediate experience of the reader's own life. The sewing circle that gathered around the table after dinner in the servants' hall was not merely a practical arrangement, but a social one. The work, mending household linen, making personal garments, embroidering small items that were either for personal use or for sale, at one of the modest markets of the Victorian domestic economy, was secondary to the conversation that accompanied it. The needle moved and the thread followed, and the conversation wound through the same subjects it always wound through, returning to the same themes and departing from them and returning again, as conversations among people who know each other well always do. The conversations in the servants' hall are mostly unrecorded, of course. They have not come down to us in any systematic way, these evening exchanges between people whose working lives were spent largely in the business of other people. But occasional fragments survive. In the diaries and letters, in the memoirs that some servants eventually wrote, in the social investigations that certain Victorians undertook into the conditions of domestic life. And from these fragments it is possible to reconstruct something of what was said, and how, and in what spirit. They talked about the family, but not only about the family. They talked about themselves, their plans, their troubles, their desires for the future. They talked about the people they had known in previous positions, the households they had passed through, the accumulated characters and events that constituted the social world below stairs. They talked about home, the villages and towns and farms they had come from. The families they had left behind, the landscapes of memory that the settled life of service could not entirely displace. They were homesick, many of them, at least initially. The young girl who came to service at 14 and spent her first weeks in the alien environment of a London household, its size, its pace, its complexity so different from anything she had known, carried the pain of displacement that any uprooting produces. The smell of a particular food, or the quality of light on a particular afternoon, or the sound of someone speaking a word in a dialect she recognised from home. Any of these could produce a sudden sharp awareness of absence, a missing of specific people and specific places that was as physical as hunger. This homesickness was not indulged mostly. The professional requirements of domestic service did not provide space for visible emotion of this kind, and the social conventions of the servants' hall, which mirrored, in their way, the conventions of the family's rooms, did not encourage displays of personal distress. The young housemaid who was homesick kept it to herself during the working day, and perhaps spoke of it quietly in the evening to another girl who understood, who might herself have felt it and still feel it, who could offer the comfort of recognition if not of remedy. But there were also genuine moments of happiness below stairs. The satisfaction of work well done, felt as a physical ease in the body at the end of a successful day, the warmth of a friendship, the pleasure of a conversation that was funny and light and free of the constraints of the working hours, the anticipation of a Thursday afternoon, the particular pleasure of time that belonged to you, the satisfaction of a letter written and sent home, of connection maintained across distance, of the network of affection that bound these displaced people to the places and the people they had come from. There was laughter in the servants' hall. This is worth saying explicitly, because it is easy to construct an image of below-stairs life that is all drudgery and constraint, and to forget that human beings who spend 12 hours a day together develop a shared humour and a shared language and a shared capacity for finding the absurd in the situations they inhabit together. The footman's impression of the master's particular way of requesting a second helping. The cook's rueful account of the catastrophe narrowly averted in the kitchen that evening. The hallboy's report on the extraordinary content of a conversation he had overheard while cleaning boots in the passage. These were the materials of a below-stairs comedy that was never performed for an audience, but that was real and sustaining and important to the people who participated in it. Comedy was a survival mechanism. In a life that offered limited formal respite from physical labour and social constraint, the ability to find things funny, to see the absurdity in one's situation, and to share that perception with others, was a genuine resource. The Victorian domestic servants who possessed this ability, who could laugh at the hardships without being hardened by them, who could find the human comedy in the gap between the ideal of service and the lived reality of it, these were the ones who moved through their years below stairs with something more than mere endurance. The Victorian household followed the rhythms of the English seasons in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate from the distance of our own climate-controlled, seasonally indifferent modern lives. Spring was felt most immediately in the kitchen, where the first produce from the kitchen garden, the early lettuces under cloches, the asparagus from the established beds. The new potatoes, if the season had been kind, arrived with a quality of freshness and sweetness that the stored winter vegetables could never quite match. The cook who received the first asparagus of the year in the kitchen received something genuinely valued, something that the months of turnip and parsnip and stored root vegetables had created an appetite for. She prepared it simply, steamed and served with butter, or arranged on the dish with a sauce of hollandaise, and the simplicity was appropriate because the ingredient itself needed nothing more. In the bedrooms, spring cleaning was the great seasonal upheaval that the winter's work had been building toward. The household was turned inside out, in a sense, every room attacked in a systematic sequence, the carpets removed and beaten, the curtains taken down and sent to the laundry, the walls swept free of cobwebs with long-handled brushes, the upholstered furniture moved and cleaned beneath, the mattresses taken out and aired in the garden, the china and ornaments washed in warm soapy water and replaced in their positions, the windows cleaned to maximum transparency. The spring cleaning was not undertaken in a day or even a week. In a large house, the full spring cleaning was a rolling process that moved through the rooms over several weeks, the household managing to remain functional while each section was in turn disrupted and restored. The housekeeper managed this with the organisational skill that was her professional signature, scheduling the rooms in an order that minimised the disruption to the family while maximising the efficiency of the work. There was something almost ceremonial about the spring cleaning, a sense that the house was being renewed, that the winter's accumulation was being removed and the fresh season welcomed. This was not merely practical. The Victorians had a strong sense of the symbolic relationship between domestic cleanliness and moral order, and the spring cleaning carried something of that symbolic weight. The house made clean as a gesture toward renewal, toward the fresh start that spring, meteorologically and metaphorically was understood to represent. Summer brought the house parties. If the family's social calendar included a period of country house entertaining, guests staying for a week or more, shooting parties or garden parties or cricket matches on the lawn, the servant staff entered one of the most intensive periods of their year. Additional staff were brought in for the duration, usually temporary help recruited through the local registry office or through the housekeeper's personal network of reliable contacts. The kitchen worked at expanded capacity. The laundry ran more frequently, the footmen were on duty for longer hours, the housemaids servicing more rooms. The house party was, in a sense, the great Victorian household's most complete expression of its own potential. All the skills and preparations and daily routines were in this period fully tested, fully engaged, fully on display. The impression made on guests was the impression made on the wider world. The news of how well or how poorly a house party had been managed travelled through the social network of the class it had served, and a house that entertained beautifully gained a reputation that was valuable in ways that extended beyond the purely social. The servants worked very hard during house parties. The hours lengthened. The standards required were at their highest pitch. The opportunity for rest was reduced. But there were compensations. The energy of a full house, the variety introduced by new faces and new requirements, the specific pleasure of performing at one's best before an audience that included strangers capable of appreciating the performance. House parties had their own atmosphere of heightened activity, and many servants found that atmosphere stimulating rather than merely exhausting. Autumn was the season of the kitchen's greatest abundance. The harvest from kitchen garden and orchard arrived in waves. First the early apples, then the main crop, then the pears, then the late-keeping varieties that would see the household through the winter. The plums came and went in their different sorts, the damsons last of all, used for their jams and cheeses and the particular sharp note they gave to game sauces. The quinces arrived golden and fragrant in October, transformed by long cooking into the deep ruby paste, the membrillo, that kept through winter in covered crocks. The walnuts fell from the tree in the corner of the kitchen garden and were gathered for pickling, the young nuts in late summer for the green pickle, the mature ones in autumn for storage. The kitchen in October and November was a place of concentrated preservation activity. The cook and the housekeeper between them managed the making of jams and jellies, chutneys and pickles, the potting of meats under clarified butter, the making of fruit cheeses and curds. The still room hummed with activity. The store cupboard filled with the summer's distillation into keeping forms, jars and crocks and bottles lined up on the shelves, labelled in the housekeeper's neat handwriting, their contents eventually to be deployed through the months when the garden offered little. There was a particular pleasure in this preservation activity, in the transformation of abundance into reserve, in the making of things that would be needed later and would be valued then in proportion to how good they were now. The woman who made excellent strawberry jam in June was making something that would be opened in February to a warmth of pleasure and memory that was worth the summer's labour. These were small but real forms of foresight and care, of providing for the future with the materials of the present, and they were taken seriously. Winter was the longest and most demanding of the household seasons, not only because of the increased burden of fires and coal, and the cold that pressed in on every imperfectly sealed window and door, but because of the psychological quality of the long dark evenings, the short days, the sense that the world had contracted to the house and its immediate circle. The Christmas season was the one great formal celebration below stairs, the Christmas dinner for the servants, sometimes provided by the family as an act of seasonal generosity, the small gifts of money or goods that convention required the family to distribute, the extra glass of wine that the butler might permit on Christmas evening. These customs were important not only for their practical content, but for what they represented, an annual acknowledgement that the relationship between family and servants was not purely contractual, that some form of mutual recognition and gratitude was appropriate and was owed. Not every family managed this acknowledgement gracefully. There were households where the Christmas gifts were perfunctory and the seasonal generosity was minimal, and the servants noted this and it coloured their view of the family for whom they worked. But in many households, Christmas was the occasion when the usually maintained distance between the family's world and the servants' world was briefly reduced, when the family came below stairs to say thank you, when the children were allowed to visit the kitchen and eat the cook's shortbread, when the normal hierarchies were relaxed just enough to acknowledge the human reality that underpinned them. These moments were small and temporary, They did not fundamentally alter the structure of the relationship, but they were valued, and their absence would have been noted. And their presence made the difficult aspects of service slightly more bearable, and the comfortable aspects slightly more genuinely comfortable. The year turned. The fires were laid, and the fires died and were laid again. The silver was polished and tarnished and polished again. The bread was made and eaten and made again. The whole enormous engine of the household renewed itself each morning and ran through its day, and came to rest each night and began again. And in the bedrooms at the top of the house, in the small cold rooms that the house's architects had designed for utility rather than comfort, the servants who had run this engine lay in their narrow beds, and slept the sleep of the genuinely tired, their bodies restoring themselves for tomorrow's repetition, their minds, if we can say anything about the minds of people about whom we know so little, perhaps dreaming of the various things that tired bodies dream: home, rest, warmth, the faces of people loved and distant, the particular green of fields remembered from childhood, the smell of something cooking that had nothing to do with anyone else's dinner. Tomorrow the fires would need laying, tomorrow the silver would need polishing, tomorrow the bells would ring and the bread would need making and the boots would need cleaning and the table would need setting and all the rest of it. But tomorrow was tomorrow. Tonight the house was still. The social world below stairs was stratified not only by rank and function, but by geography and background. A Victorian household drew its servants from a wide range of origins, and the diversity of those origins created a texture of difference that enriched the shared life of the servants' hall in ways that were not always comfortable, but were usually interesting. The cook who had trained in a French household in Paris, or who had spent years working for a family in the major cities, brought with her a slightly different culinary vocabulary from the cook who had learned her trade entirely in English country houses. The footman from Scotland had grown up with a different social world from the footman from Kent. The lady's maid, who had spent 5 years with a family that wintered in the south of France, had seen and absorbed things that her colleagues who had never left England had not, and this difference of experience, of exposure, of the particular knowledge that travel deposits in a person, was a living presence in the servants' hall conversations. These differences were the subject of both genuine interest and occasional friction. The cook, who had been trained in French techniques and was proud of her knowledge of classical sauces and the finer points of continental cuisine, was not always patient with a kitchen maid whose palate had been formed entirely by the relatively plain food of her English rural childhood. The footman from Scotland might find himself gently mocked for certain pronunciations or expressions that differed from the London norm. He might respond by finding equally good material in the habits of those who had never been further from London than Surrey. This was the normal social friction of people who come from different places and have to learn to live together. And it was mostly managed well. The professional requirements of domestic service, the need for smooth cooperation in service of a shared work objective, provided a strong incentive to resolve personal frictions quickly and to develop the practical working relationships that the job demanded. People who might, in other circumstances, have had little in common and little reason to seek each other's company, found in the shared work a basis for connection that could, over time, deepen into genuine affection. The friendships formed below stairs were often unusual in their cross-regional, cross-class of origin character. A young woman from a small village in Yorkshire was unlikely, outside of service, to have much occasion to form a deep friendship with a woman from a fishing village in Cornwall, or with a woman who had grown up in a Dublin tenement, or with one who had spent her childhood in service in a great house and had never known any other world. Service brought these different backgrounds into proximity, and the proximity, sustained through years of shared work and shared space, sometimes produced the kind of friendship that belongs to people who have witnessed each other's lives at close quarters. The letters that circulated between former colleagues who had moved to different positions were evidence of this depth. The housemaid who had left the household 3 years earlier to take a better position in London still wrote to her friend who remained, and the friend wrote back, and the letters sustained a relationship that the physical distance had not severed. These networks of correspondence connected servants across the country, maintaining friendships and exchanging information, and providing the kind of ongoing human connection that was essential to people whose working lives offered limited opportunity for sustained personal relationships. The senior servants, the housekeeper and the butler, and, in particular, sometimes formed friendships that were more formal in their expression, but no less real in their substance. Two housekeepers who had known each other through 30 years of work in adjacent households, who had exchanged recipes and household management advice and occasionally quite confidential information about the respective families they served, were friends in a way that the word did not entirely capture. They were professional colleagues in the deepest sense, people who understood each other's world from the inside, who could speak a professional shorthand that no outsider would fully understand. The butler, in many ways the most isolated figure below stairs, responsible for everything but answerable ultimately to the family, powerful within the servant world but servile within the household hierarchy, sometimes found this isolation difficult. The best butlers managed it through the same professionalism that governed every other aspect of their work. They maintained the dignity of their position, exercised their authority fairly, and found their satisfactions in the quality of the work rather than in the warmth of personal relationships. But behind that professional management, the man remained, and the man's need for connection and recognition was as real as anyone else's. There are records of butlers who managed their households with genuine wisdom and care, who looked after the welfare of their staff as well as the standards of the household, who negotiated with the family on behalf of servants who had been badly treated, who used their authority to protect the vulnerable rather than to oppress the weak. There are also records of butlers who were petty tyrants, whose authority expressed itself in arbitrary punishment and excessive demand, who made life miserable for those below them in the hierarchy. The difference was, in the end, a matter of character, the same qualities that make power in any context either beneficial or damaging. The housekeeper's maternal authority, the quasi-parental responsibility she exercised over the younger women in her charge, was most clearly expressed in the management of the housemaid's health and welfare. In an era before national health services and without easy access to medical care for working people, the housekeeper was often the first resource for a servant who was unwell. She kept a small medicine chest in her room, stocked with the remedies that Victorian domestic medicine relied on: cough mixtures, digestive preparations, plasters and bandages, the tonics that were believed to restore strength after illness. She assessed sickness with the practiced eye of someone who had seen enough of it to distinguish the serious from the minor, who knew when a day's rest would restore a girl to working order and when the doctor needed to be sent for. The sending for a doctor was itself a matter requiring judgment, both medical and social. Doctors cost money, and a housekeeper who sent for the doctor unnecessarily was wasting the household's resources. But a housekeeper who failed to recognise serious illness and allowed it to become serious illness allowed to progress was failing in her duty of care. The judgment call between these two possibilities was made in real time, on the basis of observation and experience, and it was one of the less visible but real responsibilities of the housekeeper's position. When servants were seriously ill, with the serious infections that were common in Victorian England, with typhoid or tuberculosis or the various conditions that then had no adequate treatment, the question of what happened to them became urgent. In some households, the family took responsibility for nursing a sick servant, providing medical care and the necessary accommodation during recovery. In others, the servant was sent home to their family, which might involve a long and difficult journey in a state of illness, with uncertain support at the destination. In the worst cases, a servant who was too ill to work and who had no family in a reachable distance was effectively without resources. There were charitable institutions that existed to address this vulnerability: convalescent homes for domestic servants, charitable funds maintained by professional associations, the networks of church-based mutual aid that provided some support to working women in difficulty. These institutions were insufficient for the need they faced, but they existed, and they expressed the recognition, present in Victorian society if not always acted on with sufficient energy, that the people who maintained the comfort of the wealthy were sometimes themselves in need of care. The green baize door was, in many Victorian houses, literally a door covered in the dense, somewhat rough fabric from which it took its name, a practical choice, because baize was durable and absorbed sound, reducing the noise that inevitably accompanied the working life on one side from reaching the quieter, more cultivated spaces on the other. The colour was usually a dark bottle green, though in some houses it might be red or dark blue, and the particular shade was part of the house's identity, part of what distinguished it from other houses with similar arrangements. The door swung in both directions, This was a design detail with social implications. It could be pushed from either side, could be opened by a servant carrying a tray or by a family member passing through in either direction, and it closed by itself, a weighted mechanism ensuring that it never stood open and allowed the two worlds to interpenetrate more than the passage of people and things required. The spring in its hinge was the mechanical enforcement of a social boundary. On one side of the door the carpets began. The quiet, the warmth sustained by good fires and thick curtains, the visual richness of well-chosen furnishings, all of this started at the door, or rather all of this ended at the door, because the direction of approach determined which side was which. From the servant's side, the door was the threshold of the family's world, beyond which you moved differently, spoke differently, held yourself differently. From the family's side, it was the entrance to the working part of the house, the part they rarely visited, the part that produced their comfort but that was not their domain. Children were sometimes exempted from this division, at least in their earliest years. Small children in Victorian households often had more access to the servants' spaces than their parents did. They spent time in the kitchen, where the cook might give them scraps of pastry to form into shapes. They knew the names of the under-housemaids and might follow them about on their rounds with an unembodied curiosity that the adults around them could not afford. They had not yet learned to see the servant as a non-person, as a presence to be used rather than a person to be known. This childhood familiarity with the below-stairs world was one of the things that adult Victorian memoirs sometimes recalled with a quality of lost warmth. The remembered comfort of the kitchen, the remembered personality of the cook, the remembered sense that the world below stairs was somehow more human, more alive, more real than the formal world above. This memory was not universal, and it was sometimes romanticized by adults who had the luxury of romanticizing what they could no longer experience, but it pointed to something genuine, that the world of service, stripped of its social significance, was a world of skilled and caring human beings doing necessary work, and that this fact was most clearly visible to those who were not yet old enough to be fully enrolled in the social conventions that concealed it. The moment when a Victorian child crossed from the childhood familiarity of the kitchen to the adult distance of the reception rooms was rarely marked formally. It happened gradually, the increasing gravity of social training pulling the child away from the informal spaces, the increasing consciousness of class distinction making the servants' hall less a place of easy warmth and more a professional domain to which access was by specific and bounded invitation. This transition was part of the education of the Victorian upper-class child, as much as Latin and music and the correct management of cutlery. The servants, for their part, understood and managed the adult boundaries that they were required to maintain with the same professional skill they brought to everything else. The cook who had been easy and familiar with the small child learned to modulate that familiarity as the child grew older, not to withdraw warmth entirely, but to wrap it in the formality that the adult world required. This adjustment was not always easy, particularly when genuine affection had developed. A cook who had spent 10 years in a household and had known the family's children through their whole growing up carried real feeling for those children, and the adjustment to treating them as young adults entitled to the full formal deference of service was a form of loss, however small and however professionally managed. The social hierarchy that the green baize door enforced was, like all social hierarchies, a construction, a human-made arrangement that served particular social functions and that could be, and eventually was, dismantled. But it was also, within its own time and its own terms, a functioning social order that provided a framework within which large numbers of people organised their working lives and their social identities and found, in the better cases, genuine meaning and satisfaction. The Victorian servant was not enslaved, not imprisoned, not without any form of agency. She was constrained, by contract, by convention, by the limited alternatives that the social and economic structures of her time provided. But within those constraints she was a person, and she lived a person's life, with the full range of human emotion, with relationships that mattered, with skills she was proud of and work she found meaning in, with a social world that was, in its own way, rich and complex and fully human. This is what we're trying to remember in the end. Not a fairy tale of gracious service and grateful employers, not a horror story of exploitation and oppression, but the actual, complicated, full lives of actual people, their mornings and their evenings, their friendships and their griefs, their small daily satisfactions and their large life aspirations. The physical reality of their work and the interior reality of their experience of it. They were here. They woke before dawn and made the fires and cooked the bread and polished the silver. They answered the bells. They served the dinners. They made the beds and mended the linen and laundered the sheets and did all the 1,000 tasks without which the great Victorian household would have been an unheated, unlit, unfed shell of a building, meaningless and cold. And then, in the evenings, they sat around their own table and talked about the day, and someone made a joke that made everyone laugh, and someone else read aloud from a newspaper, and the fire burned and the tea was strong, and the night outside was dark and cold and the room was warm. They were here. There is something in the particular quality of deep night in a Victorian house that is worth attending to. Because it is the inverse of everything that the day has been, all the noise and warmth and activity reduced to its opposite, all the purposeful movement stilled into rest. The house in the depths of the night is full of silence that has its own texture. It is not the silence of emptiness. 16 people are sleeping within these walls, their breathing quiet and steady, their bodies doing the slow restorative work of sleep. But the silence of activity suspended, of the house between one day and the next, poised in the dark between what has been done and what will need to be done. The fires have died or are dying, the coals settling into themselves with the occasional small sound of contraction, the warmth they produced radiating gently outward and eventually dissipating into the cool of the rooms. In the kitchen, the range still holds a deep, slow heat. It will not be entirely cold by morning, and the hall boy who arrives at 5 to begin the morning's work will find it still warm to the hand, the coals at its centre still holding their glow beneath their grey coating of ash. The butler's safe is locked. The wine cellar is locked. The front door is bolted. The windows are latched. The house has been secured against the night, against whatever the night represents. The world outside, with its randomness and its unpredictability, held at bay by the weight of iron bolts and the lock's exact engagement of key and mechanism. In the bedrooms, the servants sleep the various sleeps of the various people they are. The hall boy, deepest in the sleep of youth and of the day's most fundamental physical exhaustion, is still as a stone in his narrow bed, his face young and without expression in the dark. The housemaid, who has been in the house for 15 years, sleeps with the particular quality of someone who is exactly where they have always been, in the same room, in the same bed, the room's dark spaces known and familiar around her, even in sleep. The housekeeper sleeps with her hands folded, as though even in sleep she's at her desk. The butler sleeps with the neatness of a person who has spent decades ordering everything around him, his breathing as regular and measured as the household rhythms he has spent his working life sustaining. The cook sleeps the deepest sleep of all, the sleep of genuine exhaustion after a day of sustained creative labour, the sleep that is the body's absolute claim on the rest it is owed after the work it has done. She will dream, perhaps, of dishes yet to be made, some part of her professional mind continuing its work even in sleep, planning and adjusting and finding solutions to problems not yet encountered. And the house holds them all. The stone and brick and wood and plaster, the accumulated weight of the building, the accumulated years of its occupation. All of it gathered around these sleeping people, these people who have given their days to its maintenance, and who are now given back for a few hours to the simple animal reality of sleep. The stars outside are very bright tonight. The copper beach at the end of the drive is a dark mass against the slightly less dark sky, its remaining leaves very still in the absence of wind. The stable is quiet. The horses in their stalls and breathing in the warm smell of hay. The kitchen garden is dark and fragrant, the last of the late-season herbs sending their complicated scent into the night air. The ha-ha wall at the edge of the grounds is a dark line, and beyond it the fields open into the middle distance, and somewhere out there a nightjar is making its churring sound in the dark. The house is very small in the landscape when you think of it this way. A set of warm lights in a great dark field, a temporary assertion of human order against the older, indifferent order of the natural world. But from inside it, from inside the particular warmth of a particular room in a particular household, it is the whole world, or at least the world within which these particular lives are being lived. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the house is exactly the right size, exactly large enough to contain the 16 lives that are currently stored within it, exactly warm enough to hold them through the night, exactly real enough to be the setting for the real and various and entirely human lives that will begin again in a few hours when the hallboy's feet sound on the back stair and the day comes back. The night passes, it always passes. The darkness slowly diminishes, not all at once but by degrees, the black yielding to the dark grey to the pale grey to the thin cold light that is the first honest daylight of another morning. The house is there, the house is always there. And in it, in a few minutes, in a few more deep breaths of pre-dawn quiet, the first servant will rise. Let the image rest. Let the house be still for one more moment in its cool pre-dawn quiet. Let the day wait a little longer before it begins its claims. Let the world be for now exactly this. The house in the dark, the fires dying, the silver locked away, the bells silent on their board, 16 people breathing in 16 rooms, the night giving way to the day in its own time, in its own way, as nights always have. Sleep now. Rest now. The house is quiet and the night is long and the stars are bright and there is nothing, for this moment, that needs to be done. Nothing at all. Sleep. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one.